close to 2022, women's soccer has already started. It has a really big impact, and I think it doesn't matter where we play because we're going to be excited, and our fans are definitely going to be excited to enjoy this beautiful sport too.
Do you think if it was in 2022, it would have more of a chance to have its own platform, its chance to really impact?
Yeah, maybe like the fact that there isn't so much going on is going to allow the tournament to have more attention. But at the same time, I believe that we are creating that community, that we have the support from our fans, and that they will find the way to support us, even though there will be a lot of competitions going on.
And in terms of the Spanish national team at the moment, you know, you've been in some really good form recently as a team collectively with the World Cup last year, the She Believes Cup as well recently. Is it frustrating not to be able to try and build on that?
Yeah, I definitely agree with you. I think like in the last couple of years, we've been doing things better every year, and we are achieving the results that we had in mind. We still have a long way to go, but it's sad that we don't get to keep working and keep seeing how we're developing in the next year or so. But like I said, I think right now the fact that like our fans remain safe, our staff, us players, and just like our community and our society, it's way bigger than anything.
Absolutely. And then if we had the Euros in 2020, or if we had the Olympics in 2021, potentially a women's Euros in 2022, and then another World Cup in 2023, that's three pretty decent summers.
Absolutely. I think that would be a great scenario for fans. It will give them the opportunity to follow soccer, to enjoy this sport as much as we do. And maybe on the bright side and on a positive note, it will also keep us athletes fit and through really good years of competition. So I don't know. I think right now the most important thing is to remain positive, and regardless of what the final decision is, I am sure that everybody, the fans and also the teams and the players, will make the best out of it and will provide a good environment and a good show.
Talk to me then about the domestic season, the NWSL. You mentioned that the pre-season was postponed and it was due to get underway the season proper in a couple of weeks' time. That's all been pushed back now. What sort of communication are you getting from the league?
So right now we are getting lots of information from the league, from the team, from the coaching staff. I pretty much receive like an email every 3 days, and things are changing a lot. I think the situation is evolving. The laws that get sent from the government also change every day, so it's really hard to have a clear picture. But I do have the confidence and I trust that we're doing everything that we can to try to stay safe, but also to do what we can based on the situation.
We've been talking a lot about male footballers and pay cuts and how the lack of games is affecting revenues coming into it. How big of a worry is this crisis on the viability of the women's game as well?
I think when you put money, when you compare money to humans' life, there is no question that human lives are way more important. So I think like money, yeah, sure, it's important and it allows us to do what we love, but it has nothing to do with humans' life. And right now, like I said, it's obviously our priority is to keep people healthy and to keep everybody in the best circumstances and conditions that we can.
That's brilliant, Celia. Thank you so much for your time, and I hope you continue to stay safe and that your family remain well as well.
Thank you. You too.
Okay. Okay, to boxing now, because Anthony Joshua will have to wait longer to defend his IBF, WBA, WBO and IBO World Heavyweight titles after his fight with Kubrat Pulev was postponed this week. The bout was due to take place at the Tottenham Hotspur Stadium in June, but a new date is now being worked on. So let's speak to our boxing reporter, Adi Adedoyan now. Adi, it's hard to speculate about when this may take place, but is there any sort of rough guidance when a new date may be held for this?
Well, it was interesting that Kubrat Pulev, a week before the fight was postponed, said he didn't expect it to go through in June as scheduled, and he suggested that at the end of the year is more realistic. I suppose the problem that Eddie Hearn, who promotes Anthony Joshua, faces at the moment is that football is suspended indefinitely, so you don't know when Tottenham are going to have to play their home games at their ground, which is where he wants to stage the fight. So he's going to have to potentially find a new venue, find a new date. With so many fights being cancelled at the moment, they're going to be scrambling for dates and venues when the restrictions are lifted. But realistically, it's looking like it's going to be at the end of the year at some point.
And we know, when you mentioned some other fights being cancelled or postponed, we know that the Deontay Wilder and Tyson Fury one has been postponed. So now we're going to have to wait even longer for that much anticipated contest between Fury and Joshua.
Yeah, Deontay Wilder and Tyson Fury were due to meet for the trilogy fight in July, but that got postponed because of the global pandemic. Again, that's looking like it's going to happen at the end of the year, which then knocks back a potential showdown between the winner, which many expect to be Tyson Fury again, facing Anthony Joshua to perhaps next year. The only way that fight could happen this year is if the promoters of Fury and Joshua get together and offer Deontay Wilder and Kubrat Pulev some step-aside money. It happens in boxing. You can give them, $2 million to say, we'll get this fight done, and then you face the winner. It happens, and it's been done in the past. It's been done before in the past. It's whether Deontay Wilder would want to wait potentially for another 6 or 7 months once the restrictions are lifted before getting back in the ring. That's the main issue. But realistically, it's looking like Tyson Fury and Anthony Joshua, if they win their respective bouts, won't be meeting until next year at some point.
And Adi, when we talk about, lead-in into different bouts, a lot is made of the time in training camp and how that all works and the amount of weeks that they have. How is this all affecting these fighters now?
It must be very difficult because you train to peak on a certain day. Take, for example, Dillian Whyte, who is the WBC's interim champion. He was due to fight on the 2nd of May in Manchester. He's in Portugal at the moment, training for that fight. It got moved now, it got postponed because of the pandemic, and the new date is July. I spoke to him a few days ago, and he said the difficulty is you're trying to observe all the rules about social distances whilst being in this training camp, and you're training, but mentally it's tough because you don't know whether that July date is going to be moved again. There's also the financial ramifications of all this, because he said there are 8 people in his training camp. He has to pay them, house them, and feed them. Training camps run into thousands anywhere, and imagine if this gets moved again in July, he's going to be racking up the cost. So it's very, very difficult mentally and difficult financially for these fighters. But then there is a wider issue, which is this global pandemic. And he said when I spoke to him that, that's the main focus, that let's get over this first and then we'll worry about everything else afterwards.
We had the news during the week of the new dates for the Olympics. They're being postponed until 2021, and that is proving a bit of an interesting dilemma for amateur boxers.
Yeah, because the Olympic Games provides a great springboard into the professional ranks. You take Anthony Joshua, for example, who won gold in London in 2012. That really propelled him into the professional ranks because, one, he would have been watched by millions on free-to-air TV, so built up a bit of a fan base, and it's a great selling point when you put him on a bill. This is the Olympic champion, and it helps to build his profile. So there were a lot of fighters who I'm sure would have been thinking about trying to win an Olympic medal and then turn it pro, but now you've got a decision to make. Do you wait for another year and go through the qualification process in the amateurs, which can be quite long and arduous and grueling, or do you just take the leap? One such fighter is Keyshawn Davis of the United States. He won a world silver medal last year, being counted as a heavy favorite for gold in Tokyo. I spoke to him last week, and he said there's a 70% chance that he'll just forego the Olympic Games and turn pro later this year once the restrictions are lifted. Clarissa Shields is a double Olympic champion from London and Rio. She's the undisputed middleweight champion now in the professional ranks. And she says that the Olympic medals that she has were very, very important in terms of building her profile. And she will encourage anybody who's facing this dilemma to stay in the amateur ranks and go for gold before turning pro.
I'm a 3-time division world champion, faster than any other boxer in history. Up in 10 fights. And now my next fight, my 11th fight, I'll be fighting to become undisputed, not only at 160 but at 154 pounds. It sprung me that far, and not just because it's women's boxing, but I'm experienced enough to where when people look at my record and who I'm fighting against, the commission, they don't say, "Oh, she doesn't have enough experience to fight against this other girl fighter or this other world champion because of my amateur pedigree." Sometimes fighters get denied to fight against world champions because one, they don't have enough fights, or one, they have enough fights but not enough experience. And the people would be like, you know what? No, we don't think that this fighter is ready to fight against a world champion. So I think that my amateur career has been like just a big boost.
And you know, your bout against Marie-Eve Piquet for the undisputed junior middleweight title, which was due to take place on the 9th of May, has been postponed because of the pandemic. How are you managing to train and to stay in shape with gyms closed and all these rules about social distancing?
Well, I had just bought a house right before this whole pandemic got really, really serious about 3 weeks ago. When I got the house, the first thing I did, I was like, you know what? My gym is big enough for a gym. So I went and got a boxing bag. I went and got a treadmill. I went and bought a crunch bench and some weights. And like my basement is like my gym. I even went and put in like a new floor, like a little soft floor when I'm bouncing and stuff. It's not really hard on my knees. And me and my boyfriend just kind of put my gym together. My best friend, my boyfriend, and my nephew came over and put the treadmill together. So that's what I'm doing really. I'm running on my treadmill. I'm punching my bag, and I'm kind of just at my new house, still training really.
Yeah, mentally though, how tough is it to keep training and keep going when you don't have a date, you don't have this target date that you're aiming for?
I mean, I don't like being fat. You know, I'm tired. I mean, people will say, "Oh, you're not fat," but to me, I'm a little chunky right now. I'm 170 pounds, and not only do I want to lose weight, of course, for the fight that's postponed, but because I want to fit, I want to fit inside my favorite clothes. Like I can't wear my half shirts because I don't feel comfortable wearing my half shirts without having a 4 pack or at least a 6 pack. So it's like for me, that's why I want to work out and want to get some of my weight down. It's really not all just because boxing. That's not the only reason why I, lose weight. I want to get at least 5, 10 pounds off just because I want to wear my favorite shirts. So that's kind of my motivation for right now.
When are you realistically hoping that you can get back in the gym and actually make history as you want to do, which is become the first boxer to be the undisputed champion in 2 weight classes?
I don't know. I'm not even thinking about the date right now. It's like when they give me the date, I'm quite sure I'll have 6 to 8 weeks to get ready, and I'll spend that 6 to 8 weeks getting ready. But I don't know. I don't know how long this coronavirus is going to be around. They said April 13th, and then April 13th has went to turn to April 30th, and then in some places they've already canceled school for the rest of the year and said this is not going to be over till August. June. So I have no idea when I'll be back in the ring.
Clarissa Shields there. When we look at the return to sport after all this, the British Boxing Board of Control said this week that they may have to consider running tests for the coronavirus on their fighters as part of medicals. Is that a likely measure to be taken potentially across the world?
Yeah, that's an interesting one because they say they're thinking about that at the moment. So the complication with all this is that the British Boxing Board of Control have jurisdiction over fights happening in Britain. You take the United States, for example, it's a different setup there. Jurisdiction goes from state to state. So fights happening in Las Vegas come under the jurisdiction of the Nevada state. In New York, it's the New York State Athletic Commission. In California, it's a different commission. And these commissions have different rules and regulations. So it'd be up to the individual commission to make that decision. The other complication with it all is it's one thing testing the fighters and their entourage to make sure that they are not carrying the virus. All promoters that I've spoken to have pretty much said they're not going to put on fights behind closed doors. So you're going to be putting on fights in packed arenas, hopefully, once the restrictions are lifted. If you test the fighters, that's fine. But what about the members of the public that turn up? If you go to the O2 Arena in London, which houses 20,000 odd people, are you going to ask everybody who comes in there to be tested? Logistically, how is that going to be possible? So whilst it's a good idea, it comes with a bit of complications. And, the point is we're in unprecedented times. Nobody knows how to proceed in this situation. That's one option being considered. But the implementation and ensuring that anybody who's in that arena, if it's a packed arena, is safe, is obviously the major challenge.
Absolutely. Adi Adedoyan, our boxing reporter there. Now, on Saturday on Sports World, we were supposed to be bringing you the highlight of the British horse racing calendar, the Grand National, live from Aintree, but we know that the race was cancelled. There was still some action to enjoy as the virtual Grand National took centre stage. Tiger Roll was the favourite to become the first horse to win the Grand National 3 years in a row, but he wasn't able to back that form up in the digital Aintree race as Potter's Corner took victory. So let's speak to racing journalist Gina Bryce now. Gina, I watched it from my couch in my house in Manchester, and I was just delighted to have something to watch, and it seemed like it was well received.
Absolutely, and I think everyone was very much in the same boat. We've been starved of any sport, of any racing since the end of March, and it was just a little bit of light diversion. It's a race that's been going for 4 years now, in fact, this virtual Grand National. For the previous 3 years, obviously it takes very much a backseat to the main event itself, but it was thrust onto the big stage, the spotlight was on it, and it was easy to forget, I don't know about you, when you were watching the horses go around, particularly if you'd had a little flutter on the race, that you were watching a virtual race. Such were the computer-generated imagery and the falls, the drama, the excitement. It was almost easy to forget that you weren't watching the real thing. It was quite an incredible feat.
Yeah, it was really good. The detail they put in of, all the usual bits around the course, and even the punters on the sides and everything. It was really good. How was it received by the racing community themselves?
I think it was great fun, actually. It generated a lot of great comments and feedback on social media. There was a lot of ribbing of some of the jockeys. Tiger Roll's jockey Davy Russell, who'd led throughout in the race, in the virtual race, which is not Tiger Roll's usual style, had come in for a bit of stick with people saying, what sort of a ride was that? And the trainers about to kick in the TV, and that they were pretending to have this sort of feud. There was Richard Johnson, who's of course been champion jockey for the last 4 years, and he's got a pretty, considering what a great jockey he is, a dismal record in the National. He actually got round and finished about 16th in the virtual version, so he was tweeting saying, I'll take that, that's a good result for me. And there was a jockey called Charlie Deutsch who suffered that terrible fall at the second last of ASO when he was leading. He's a big outsider at 66 to 1. And he's got a new profile picture now of him face planting over the second last. So there was quite a lot of banter, quite a lot of fun, and a huge amount of people tuning in to see it.
And this was done to raise money for the NHS and the charities that way. Do we know how much was raised in total?
Yeah, I've seen a figure bandied around of 2.6 million, which is phenomenal, and I'm sure there's going to be more to come, because lots of people that had a winning bet then donating their profits themselves to the NHS charities, which is an umbrella charity. It covers, I think, about 140 different organisations, but the bookmakers themselves pledging their profits to the cause to the tune of 2.6 million so far. Saw people auctioning off the commentator's race card yesterday, Stuart Machin, who commentated on the race. They have their annotated kind of highlighted card, and that made £2,000 alone with the local MP. I think there's a pledge by Aintree Racecourse to give 10,000 tickets out to Merseyside NHS and social care workers for next year's festival for the Grand National, which will hopefully be going ahead. So some great initiatives and really good stuff coming out of it. And not just that, but 4.8 million people tuned in to watch it on TV. Obviously not as many as you get for the real event, which sometimes tops 10 million, but for an average Saturday of racing, you'd usually get around 1 million or less. So 4.8 million is quite a figure, and just showed that people are looking for that support, and it's a win-win when the money's going to the NHS.
Absolutely. Gina Bryce, thank you so much for joining us. Appreciate that. Racing journalist Gina Bryce there. Now, as we know, the coronavirus pandemic is affecting people globally, and one person who was keen to help is the England netballer Leila Guscott. She plays professionally in Australia for the Adelaide Thunderbirds, but she is also a qualified doctor, and as soon as she realised the severity of the situation back in her home country of the UK, she was desperate to come home and return to her role as a junior doctor. And I spoke to her about life on the front line.
The decision to come back really was something that I thought about a couple of days before I actually found out that our league was being suspended. But things in the UK had accelerated a bit faster than in Australia, and I think I was aware that at home we were heading towards a lockdown and things were getting a bit more worrying, and I felt that I wanted to be A, closer to my family, but B, working and helping in any way that I could here with the NHS.
Leila, talk to me then, because we know that obviously you're a professional netball player, but you are also trained as a doctor, and at various points in your career you've been a netballer, and then you were a couple of years where you were doing your foundation years as a junior doctor. So is that something you're looking at getting back involved with now?
Yeah, so I started working again. So from Monday, I started back at the hospital that I was working in before I left for Australia. So I managed to get a role back there on the medical wards. It's changed quite a lot from when I last left. There's obviously loads of COVID, which I think every hospital is experiencing at the moment. So I'm back on the wards, and there's quite a large group of junior doctors, and we're on a rota which rotates around numerous medical wards, which include patients with not normal medical conditions, but the things that we see more regularly coming into hospital. Obviously, a lot of the burden at the moment is COVID, so quite a lot of the medical wards are currently filled with patients with coronavirus. So we rotate around wards that include patients, a lot of patients with coronavirus and patients with other medical conditions.
Emotionally, Leila, how is this affecting you and other doctors, having to deal with this and see this trauma and making harder decisions than you would possibly have to make on a routine day, I suppose?
It is overwhelming because it's so new, I think. And for me, I was nervous going back into it all, just not knowing what to expect. It's not something that I've read in a medical textbook, and it's not something that I've encountered before. And it's also new, and there's so much hype and media around it all that it's difficult to put that all to one side and just go to work. But I think it's a supportive atmosphere at the moment, and morale seems quite high, and people seem really engaged in trying to do the best job that we can.
Have you seen some of the claps for the NHS?
Yeah, I did, and I saw the one last week. I was pretty jet lagged, but I managed to stay up till 8 o'clock to hear it, and the one again last night. And it's amazing that people are coming out to clap for not just the NHS, but kind of carers throughout all of our society. And I hope that after this gets better and subsides, which I really hope it will do, that people still remember how great our NHS is. I feel such pride working in the NHS and think it's a really important bit of our society.
Just finally, from your point of view, as you look into looking after yourself and how you cope with the coming weeks and months, is there anything that you're going to do? I know a lot of people are, having little fitness challenges at home, or what will you do to look after yourself?
Yeah, I'm definitely trying to keep up the fitness work when I can do. I'm trying to hook in with some of my teammates to do it, so on Skype or something, trying to do sessions together. The thing I love about netball is the team element of it, and I know at this time we're all quite isolated from each other, so trying to hook in with people to do fitness or do training sessions just to make it feel less lonely. For me, I'm just trying to touch base with my friends and my family as often as I can, and just keep those relations going so that you don't feel too alone.
Yeah, amazing work from Leila Guscott there, and indeed all the frontline workers all over the world. Thank you all very much. That's it for today.
Sports World is a BBC Sport production for the BBC World Service.
You're listening to the BBC World Service, keeping you up to date and informed.
Challenging times are ahead.
The coronavirus is changing life for all of us.
Don't drop your guard.
Here at the BBC World Service, we're bringing you regular roundups.
We still don't know how long this COVID-19 hype will continue.
All the latest medical information and reports from affected areas, here on the BBC World Service. And in 30 minutes, the Cold War legacy.
With me, Rebecca Henschke. In 1965, an anti-communist purge led by the Indonesian military left at least 500,000 people dead. The Indonesian Communist Party remains banned in the country, and speaking about what happened is still dangerous.
Stay with us. The newsroom is next on the BBC World Service, the world's radio station.
A 16
15 hours GMT, India turns off its lights in response to the Prime Minister's appeal for a show of unity against the coronavirus. But critics call it a PR stunt. Spain, one of the country's hardest hit, records another daily fall in COVID-19 deaths as it reveals it's fined hundreds of thousands of people to enforce its lockdown. In Bahrain, the authorities go one step further, using electronic tags to monitor suspected cases.
If the patient moves more than 15 meters away from their smartphone, a message is sent to the authorities. The offender could then face a jail term of at least 3 months or a hefty fine of up to $26,000 or both.
And with the internet cut off in the world's largest refugee camp,
we're continuing very strongly to advocate with the government of Bangladesh to re-establish this internet connection.
Fears that Rohingya refugees are being kept in the dark about the coronavirus. That's all coming up on the newsroom.
Hello, I'm David Harper with the BBC News. Many millions of people across India have switched off their electric lights and lit lamps and candles to show solidarity in the fight against the coronavirus. The gesture of unity to last for 9 minutes was called for by the Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi. From Delhi, Divya Arya.
This show of national solidarity was designed to symbolize the victory of light over the darkness of the coronavirus pandemic. A country of more than 1 billion people switched off their lights together and flashed torches and oil lamps on their balconies. The opposition have dismissed the event as a mere photo opportunity, accusing the government of failing to address more pressing issues such as facilities for health workers and financial support for the poor.
Spain has fined more than 300,000 people for flouting coronavirus restrictions that began 3 weeks ago. The Interior Minister said nearly 3,000 people had been arrested. But as Guy Hedgecoe reports from Madrid, there are signs of hope about the pandemic itself.
Although the daily death toll remains high in Spain, these latest figures reinforce the hope that the virus is stabilising. The number of deaths over the last 24 hours, 674, is the lowest figure for a week and a half. The number of new infections, just over 6,000, also reflects a slowing of the spread of coronavirus. Spain has been in lockdown for 3 weeks. The Prime Minister, Pedro Sanchez, plans to extend that measure until the end of the month at the earliest, in order to ensure that the virus's spread is brought under control.
Tuscany is the latest province in northern Italy to make it obligatory for residents to wear a face mask when leaving their homes. The governor of Tuscany said he decided to distribute 10 million masks for free and would make another 10 million available later. Police in Britain have issued a warning to Scotland's Chief Medical Officer, Catherine Calderwood, for twice visiting her family's second home, ignoring her own coronavirus advice to avoid travel. This report from Alexandra Mackenzie.
The Chief Medical Officer has attended the daily COVID-19 briefings in Edinburgh alongside the First Minister. Their advice was to stay at home to help save lives and not travel to holiday homes. But today the Scottish Sun published photographs of Catherine Calderwood at her second home in Fife. Scotland's CMO said she knew how important the advice was and didn't want her mistake to distract from that.
The number of people in Britain who've died after testing positive for the coronavirus has risen by 621, slightly down on the previous day. The total since the start of the outbreak now stands at nearly 5,000. This suggests the surge may be slowing down. Live from London, you're listening to the latest world news from the BBC. A former Libyan interim Prime Minister, Mahmoud Jibril, has died of COVID-19 at the age of 67. He had been an influential figure in Colonel Muammar Gaddafi's regime, but claimed he had little choice. In 2011, he played a central role in toppling Gaddafi, leading the National Forces Alliance and becoming Prime Minister after Gaddafi was toppled. Mr. Jibril had been in quarantine in a Cairo hospital since being diagnosed with coronavirus on March the 27th. The first case of coronavirus has been confirmed in South Sudan. Officials say the patient is a 29-year-old woman working for the United Nations who recently arrived in the country from the Netherlands. The news was announced by the Vice President, Riek Machar, in Juba.
The patient is a 20-year-old female who arrived in the country from Netherlands via Addis Ababa. She has no history of underlying or pre-existing illness.
Experts have warned that the consequences could be dire if the virus spreads rapidly in South Sudan, which has extremely limited health facilities. The South African government says it has identified a private hospital in Durban as a hotspot for coronavirus infection. It wants anyone who has been a patient at the city's St. Augustine's Hospital since the beginning of March to contact the local health authority. South Africa is the worst hit country on the continent, with more than 1,500 cases. A South African couple on honeymoon have been left stranded on an island in the Maldives after the coronavirus outbreak prevented them from returning home. Olivia and Raoul de Freitas are now the only guests remaining at their five-star island resort, and they're worried they'll be bankrupted if the lockdown continues for much longer. Ms. de Freitas told the New York Times that everyone thought they wanted to be stuck on the tropical island, until, of course, it actually happened. That's the latest BBC News.
Hello and welcome to the newsroom for the BBC World Service with me, Jeanette Jalil. Within the past hour, millions of Indians have switched off the lights in their homes and lit candles and oil lamps in response to an appeal from the Prime Minister Narendra Modi to dispel the darkness of the coronavirus pandemic. Let's speak to our correspondent in Delhi, Divya Arya. So, Divya, how did it go? Was there a big response to the Prime Minister's appeal?
Well, there was absolute compliance till as far as I could see from my balcony. Completely dark out there, and lots of mobile torches being flashed, lots of oil lamps. In fact, the exuberance was so much that there were firecrackers being burst. There were also slogans being shouted of Hail Mother India. And that's not just happened in my neighborhood, but across the country. I've been looking at reports coming from different parts of the country, similar things, fireworks and conch playing, which is a very symbolic Hindu tradition of announcing victory, and slogans of Hail Mother India.
But this has been dismissed by Mr. Modi's critics as a PR stunt.
Indeed, but it seems that it has been quite popular with people. Now, the critics say that this is a gimmick to take away attention from what the government needs to answer for, and that is facilities for health workers. There have been many complaints that personal protective equipment is not available and doctors are being forced to do their duty without adequate protection. Then there's also been a lot of criticism of people being not given enough notice when the lockdown, which India is now in the middle of a 3-week lockdown, we're into the 11th day, and people didn't have enough notice and therefore have suddenly been rendered jobless without enough savings and are struggling for food to eat.
And what is the government doing in response to this criticism? Because there have been some really heartbreaking stories about how this lockdown has hurt India's poor.
Indeed, there are thousands, tens of thousands of people who work in big cities but come from villages and smaller cities. Now, these are daily wage labor, so they do not have, deep pockets. And when the lockdown was announced with just a 4-hour notice, a 3-week lockdown with just a 4-hour notice, there was panic. They wanted to return to their houses where they felt that they had some support from their families, some savings, some way to even feed themselves. But that did not happen, and they now feel very stranded. And despite the government promising them a financial package, food and shelter, it remains to be seen how those benefits will reach them because so many restrictions are in place.
Divya, thank you. Spain is entering its 4th week of a near total lockdown, and the country that has seen the second highest number of coronavirus deaths after Italy is now hoping that it's starting to see the light at the end of the tunnel. The number of people to die from the disease has fallen again today, although it's still well over 600, and there's also been a downward trend in the rate of infection in the past week. Let's go to Madrid now, and our correspondent Guy Hedgeco. And Guy, just talk us through the significance of these latest figures. Is Spain finally turning a corner?
Well, that certainly seems to be the feeling. Over the last few days, the government has been saying that was the case, that the figures are stabilising. Today's number of deaths from the last 24 hours is 674. Obviously, that's still a very dramatic number, but it's much lower than yesterday's, which was 809. Just a few days ago, we had well over 900. So that number seems to be coming down, as does the number of new daily infections. The latest number was just over 6,000, which again sounds like a lot, but that's quite a bit lower than we had been seeing earlier on in this crisis. So the authorities believe that this reflects a stabilisation of the figures, and that although they are still rather dramatic, and that total number of deaths at over 12,000 obviously is tragic, but the figures do seem to be coming down, or coming under control at least.
And this seems to be in large part down to the lockdown, which the Spanish government wants to extend for another 2 weeks. And we've been hearing how strictly Spain has been enforcing this lockdown, with a huge number of people being fined.
Yes, that's right. The Interior Minister, Fernando Grande Marlaska, has given us the latest figures in terms of fines and arrests related to violations of the lockdown. And over 300,000 people have been fined because of that, and nearly 3,000 people have been arrested for related infractions. So, that sounds like a huge number, and that perhaps suggests that lots of people are out flouting these restrictions. But I think what it also points to, or perhaps what it points to more, is how strictly the police are enforcing these restrictions. They've carried out 3 million checks on cars, for example, and there is a very heavy police presence, and they really are clamping down when it comes to enforcing these restrictions. But also, I think people feel a social responsibility to comply with this state of emergency as well. So that helps explain why it seems to be working broadly, even though there have been this high number of fines.
Guy, thank you very much for that. In Italy, there's also hope that the crisis has passed its peak. Our Europe correspondent, Jean McKenzie, is in Rome.
We had some encouraging signs yesterday that not only has Italy reached the peak of its epidemic, but things could be starting to turn around. So we had fewer deaths yesterday than the day before, 681. That's the first time deaths have been in the 600s for well over a week now. And for the first time since this crisis began, the number of patients in intensive care fell. Hospitals finally starting to see some progress. The lockdown at the moment is to take place until the 13th of April, so that's after Easter. Now, there was some suggestion from Italy's emergency response team just the other day that this could well be extended until May. I think it's too early to say yet how long this lockdown is going to go on for. It's very much going to depend on what happens to the infection rates over the coming weeks and the death rates, because the authorities here are desperate to prevent the likelihood of a second outbreak or a resurgence of infections. They're saying it's too early to ease restrictions, and restrictions will be tight today on Palm Sunday. Roadblocks are being stepped up. Police telling people please to stay at home, not to do what they would usually do on Palm Sunday here, which is visit friends and families, taking that traditional gift of an olive branch round to each other.
Jean McKenzie. You're listening to the BBC World Service. Now David has the headlines.
Tens of millions of Indians have turned off their lights and lit candles in a show of unity against the coronavirus. But critics say it's a gimmick that could threaten the power grid. Spain, one of the worst affected countries, has recorded a further fall in the number of deaths from COVID-19. And police in Scotland have issued a warning to the country's chief medical officer, who ignored her own coronavirus advice and travelled to her second home.
South Africa is the country worst hit by the coronavirus pandemic on the entire continent of Africa. But the government lockdown, which came into force 10 days ago, has not only had an effect on the spread of the virus, but it's also had an effect on serious crime. Well, our Africa regional editor, Will Ross, joins me. So tell us more about this dropping crime.
Yeah, well, it's interesting that the police have given out these statistics which certainly show a reduction in the amount of crime that's gone on over the last few days. What the authorities have been saying, they've sort of divided it up into various categories, but they're saying, comparing the first week of the lockdown, when these severe restrictions have been in place, with the same week a year ago, murder cases have gone down from 326 to 94, and reported rape cases have gone down from 699 to 101. So a dramatic fall there, and also assault involving grievous bodily harm from well over 2,500 down to under 500 cases. So fairly dramatic drops in those statistics that they've given out.
I suppose it's not entirely surprising given that there is a lockdown. What is the reason the authorities are giving for this big drop in crime?
Well, the authorities and the police chief himself, Becky Hele, he actually said that it's down to the fact that there's a ban on the sale of alcohol. He specifically said it was due to that, and it is true that it's hard to get hold of alcohol now in South Africa if you hadn't sort of got a supply in before the lockdown began. But of course, people will look at what's going on and the severe restrictions on movement, and say that it's basically because people can't move around to carry out these crimes. And it's also interesting that gender-based violence is still a huge problem, and the police say that over 2,000 cases of gender-based violence were recorded over a one-week period.
Well, thank you very much for that. In the US, the governor of New York, Andrew Cuomo, says that the daily number of deaths and people requiring hospital treatment due to coronavirus has been dropping for the first time in the past few days. In his daily briefing, he said 594 people had died from the virus in the past 24 hours. And despite the huge pressure on hospitals, he said he was determined that resources within the state would be shared.
The concept here that people have to get is nobody can handle this alone. This virus will overwhelm the resources of any single community. Our wisdom here in New York and our ethos is we'll help one another. This surge flex, every day we sit there allocating among hospitals, shifting gowns, shifting masks, shifting patients. We will come to a point where that wave will run right through the state. I guarantee the people of this state that as long as I'm governor of this state, we won't lose a life if we can prevent it. And we're not going to lose a life because we didn't share resources among ourselves.
The governor of New York, Andrew Cuomo. For more than 3 years, his family didn't know if he was dead or alive. Now, a prominent Chinese human rights lawyer, Wang Quanzhang, has been released by the government after spending more than 5 years in jail on subversion charges. But even though he's now been released from prison, he's still not been reunited with his family. Let's get more now on this from our Asia-Pacific editor, Michael Bristow.
He was in prison in Shandong province. His family live in Beijing. Chinese law states that people once released from prison should be allowed to go to their home address. The authorities are not allowing this. He's had to go to Jinan city, which is in Shandong province. There's a suggestion this is because of the quarantine restrictions in China because of the coronavirus, but also it's common practice in China for really prominent dissidents and lawyers like this gentleman not to be really freed when they're released. They go into house arrest or their movements are restricted. This appears to be the case in this situation. In fact, Amnesty International said it's just the illusion of freedom, really. He's still in prison, even though he's been let out of jail.
Michael Bristow. As countries around the world are repatriating their citizens, the Lebanese government has also begun bringing home the thousands of its citizens living and working abroad. The first repatriation plane arrived in Beirut from Saudi Arabia. Lina Sinjab is our reporter in the Lebanese capital.
The first round of Lebanese repatriation arrived in Lebanon today. There were 4 flights that arrived from Abu Dhabi, Saudi Arabia, Laos and Abidjan as well, bringing around 400 Lebanese expats who were registered with the government embassies in the countries where they were living to come back to Lebanon. There are at least 20,000 who've registered their names, and the government was under huge pressure to allow the repatriation of Lebanese expats. Of course, they've introduced strict measures of testing prior for their arrivals. They've requested everyone who registered at the embassy to do the test 3 days at least before they arrive, but they also have medical team on board of these flights, and they're all flying on Middle East Airlines, which is the national airline here. They will be tested upon arrival. They will be put in a hotel for 24 hours and then separate those who test negative to go on home quarantine for 14 days, and of course to follow the rules of the Ministry of Health with the lockdown and all the rules that the whole country is following these days. But also those who test positive account for students who are stranded and want to come back. Lebanon is following really strict measures. There's curfew in the streets. You can't walk out. They're trying to contain the situation. There are almost 520 cases tested positive today, 18 deaths, and the government is hoping to control the situation by continuing this lockdown.
Dina Sinjab in Beirut. In Bahrain, the authorities are now using electronic tags to monitor quarantined and self-isolating COVID-19 cases. The island nation has had several coronavirus-related deaths and about 260 confirmed cases so far. Yusuf Taha reports.
The health minister has ruled that everyone suspected to have the virus must wear the white tags, which are similar to wristwatches and are linked to smartphones with an app called Be Aware Bahrain. If the patient moves more than 15 meters away from their smartphone, a message is sent to the authorities. The offender could then face a jail term of at least 3 months or a hefty fine of up to $26,000 or both. Patients must ensure that their smartphone is always charged and connected to the internet. The tiny Gulf Kingdom has also been conducting random testing to prevent the pandemic.
Yusuf Taha. Human rights groups are calling for the internet to be restored in the world's largest refugee settlement to help prevent a potentially catastrophic coronavirus outbreak there. Nearly 1 million Rohingya Muslims currently live in the camp in Bangladesh after fleeing neighbouring Myanmar. Mobile connections there were suspended last year by authorities who cited security concerns. There haven't been any reported cases of infection there yet, but there is growing concern about the lack of information that the refugees have on how to stay safe. Here's our South Asia correspondent, Rajini Vajanathan.
Parked by the side of the road in the world's largest refugee camp is a green rickshaw with a loudspeaker tied to the top. Coronavirus is an infectious disease that can spread from person to person, booms the message. This lo-fi way of sharing health warnings is essential in a place which has been cut off from the outside world. Louise Donovan's from the United Nations Refugee Agency. The UN and human rights groups are concerned that the Bangladeshi government is still banning internet in the camps, a move which began last September.
We're continuing very strongly to advocate with the government of Bangladesh to re-establish this internet connection. This will enable people to have access to reliable information and also to have contact with their family and their loved ones.
And access to information might encourage more people to stay at home. At a food market in one of the camps, crowds gathered to buy fresh fruit and pulses, oblivious to the fact there's been a lockdown in place for more than a week. NGOs have suspended all but essential services to limit social contact and the spread of the virus. Crammed in the two-room dwelling he shares with 9 other members of his family, Saidul Rahman is teaching his children the alphabet as they gather round him. Like so many others, he's now homeschooling his children. But one thing he's not been taught about are the dangers of COVID-19.
We don't know about coronavirus. We heard that people can't stay close to each other. But our home is too small, so we don't know how we can maintain distance.
It's also hard to maintain hygiene.
We need soap to wash our hands frequently, and we don't have enough food to eat because it's difficult to get to the market. If coronavirus arrives in the camp, we don't know how we will survive.
And if it arrives in the camps, which are densely populated, there are concerns about how the healthcare system will cope. Dr. Abdullah Al-Noman from Save the Children explains.
In the camp right now, there is no facility to give any ventilator support to the patient. If the facility receives any critical cases, there are possibilities of many people could die.
The Rohingya Muslims who fled persecution in Myanmar have already survived the darkest of times. Stateless, they don't have a government looking out for them in this crisis. One refugee had this plea. Dear Corona, please stay away from Rohingya refugee camps. Dear world, please save us.
Rajini Vajanathan reporting there. Now David has some other stories from our news desk.
Morocco's King Mohammed VI has pardoned more than 5,600 prisoners and ordered their release in an effort to prevent the spread of coronavirus in the country's overcrowded jails. The Justice Ministry said inmates will be released in stages and were selected on the basis of age, health, time spent in jail and good conduct. The King also ordered new measures to protect detainees from becoming sick with the virus. The former US Vice President Joe Biden, the front-runner for the Democratic presidential nomination, has said the party may be forced to host a virtual nominating convention in August due to concerns about the coronavirus pandemic. The Democratic Party postponed its convention from July to August last week. And the president of European football's governing body UEFA, Alexander Ceferin, says playing behind closed doors is a better option than scrapping the season, but says the Champions League and Europa League could be abandoned if coronavirus restrictions remain into September. European football's club competitions are indefinitely postponed.
And staying with football, Sunday is usually a busy day for the sport around the world, but currently there are only 4 countries who are continuing to play in the midst of the COVID-19 outbreak: Belarus, Burundi, Tajikistan and Nicaragua. The decision to carry on playing in the Central American country has led to a surge of interest in their 10-team top division, but it hasn't been universally welcomed by the clubs involved. Well, Nigel Adley joins me in the studio now with more details in this. So, Nigel, it doesn't appear that the authorities in Nicaragua are taking the threat of coronavirus very seriously.
Well, there are currently 5 reported cases and 1 death in the country, and the President, Daniel Ortega, I think is determined to maintain an air of normality at a time when many other countries are enforcing quarantine and lockdowns. The Vice President, Rosario Murillo, who is also the President's wife, has insisted that tourist activities continue, and the capital, Managua, hosted a mini marathon for hundreds of fun runners on Friday to help start a week of celebrations heading towards Easter. The health minister was also sacked last week, and I think the general approach is business as usual. So football continues, and although the matches are behind closed doors, there are 3 games on Sunday.
So what can teams who are uneasy about playing actually do?
Very little, it seems. The vast majority of the teams in the top division have links with arms of the state. There's one owned by the police force, another club in Managua is bankrolled by the city's mayor, and the players who feature for these teams all say the same thing. They'll play until the government decides to call a halt. Dilianguen are the one side which voted against playing. They're independent of the state, but they did play on Wednesday. They all wore face masks and they beat the police team, and they're also playing on Sunday. And their general manager, Sergio Salazar, says the players are really scared, but they don't feel as though they have any choice. They have to play.
So is this paying off for the footballing authorities in Nicaragua? Are more people watching the Nicaraguan league now?
It seems they are. Rather like the situation in Europe, in Belarus, there are sports channels around the world with nothing to show. So they're expressing an interest in showing anything. And the Nicaraguan league falls into that category at the moment. And sports betting companies will also see it as an opportunity, because gamblers at the moment have nothing to look at either. So it could prove to be an unexpected windfall for the sport in Nicaragua. And presumably in the current climate, the president will be fairly happy about that as well.
Nigel, thank you very much for that. And a reminder of our main news this hour: tens of millions of Indians have turned off their lights and lit candles in a show of unity against the coronavirus in response to an appeal from the Prime Minister. But critics say it's a gimmick. And Spain, one of the countries worst affected by COVID-19, has recorded a further fall in the number of daily deaths. Thanks for listening to the newsroom.
This is the BBC World Service, where Linda Presley brings us the second in a new series following people on their gender journeys.
I was researching about other experiences and areas. Actually, a lot of those things that trans men tell me are very similar to what I experienced. As a kid, I wanted to be a bi.
This is Naila, 24, born female. She lived as a trans man. And this is her partner, Ellie.
I was passing as a man. I was passing so well. I felt like I got so many comments of people telling me that my transition was such a success because they couldn't tell I was trans. I was so shy to tell anyone that I was trans.
Naila and Ellie are both detransitioners, presenting again as female.
Oh, these physical changes that I experienced during my transition helped me develop a closer relationship to my body.
We're exploring how and why some trans people are returning to their assigned birth gender. Detransitioners at bbcworldservice.com/documentaries.
When Oni performed this peasant song in 1965, she was detained for 14 years. Caught up in an anti-communist killing spree here in Indonesia that left at least 500,000 people dead. Speaking about what happened remains dangerous, as there are many who don't want this dark past dug up. That's coming up after the news with me, Rebecca Henschke, in our Cold War Legacy series here on the BBC World Service.
BBC News with David Harper. Hundreds of millions of people across India have switched off their electric lights and lit lamps and candles to show solidarity in the fight against the coronavirus. The gesture, which lasted for 9 minutes, was called for by the Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi, but it was criticised as a gimmick. Spain has fined more than 300,000 people for flouting coronavirus restrictions that began 3 weeks ago. The Interior Minister said police had carried out more than 3 million checks on vehicles and people. Several thousand have been arrested. The number of coronavirus deaths has fallen for the third day running. Scotland's chief medical officer has apologised for travelling to her family's second home, despite advising all Scots to avoid travel to limit the spread of the coronavirus. Catherine Calderwood said she was truly sorry after Scottish media reported she'd made the hour-long journey twice. Tuscany is the latest province in northern Italy to make it obligatory for residents to wear a face mask when leaving their homes. The governor said he'd decided to distribute 10 million masks for free and would make another 10 million available later. A key figure in the overthrow of the Libyan dictator Colonel Gaddafi has died of the coronavirus. Mahmoud Jibril was 67. He'd been an influential figure in the Gaddafi regime, but claimed he'd had little choice. In other news, officials in Ukraine say a forest fire near the stricken Chernobyl nuclear power plant has been brought under control. The emergency service said no increased airborne radiation had been detected. It said there was no danger to people living near the 30-kilometre exclusion zone around the plant. Firefighters had earlier said they'd encountered difficulties due to higher radiation levels in some parts of the blaze. The plant's fourth reactor exploded in 1986, polluting large swathes of Europe. That's the latest BBC News.
Hello, and welcome to the third part of our BBC World Service series, The Cold War Legacy. I'm Rebecca Henschke. When Oni performed this peasant song as a teenager back in 1965, she was detained, beaten, and then jailed without trial for 14 years. Now in her 70s, it's hard to imagine this short lady with kind brown eyes and a warm smile as a schoolgirl, alone in the hands of brutal interrogators. She was caught up in an anti-communist purge here in Indonesia that left at least 500,000 people and possibly up to 3 million people dead.
Ditanya, ya itu tadi yang dicocok terus itu lubang buaya.
They kept asking me the same thing. Do you know the place where the coup took place? Why are you singing that song over and over again? And when I kept saying, I know nothing, they started hitting me. They tried to smash me in the face, but I turned and was hit on the ear. That's why I can't hear well out of this ear. Blood was coming out of my head. There was a lot of blood as they were beating me.
It was the peak of the Cold War, the decades-long standoff between the communist Soviet Union and its allies on one side and the capitalist countries led by the United States on the other. And in Indonesia, a power battle was in full swing between the military, Islamic groups and the Communist Party, PKI. It was the biggest communist party outside the Soviet Union and China. And in September 1965, the party was accused of killing 6 generals in an attempted coup.
An announcement by Jakarta Radio said the armed forces under Brigadier General Suharto had smashed the attempted coup d'etat by Lieutenant Colonel.
In response, the military and local militia went on a killing spree. Anyone suspected of having links to the Communist Party was rounded up.
The words are harsh. Smash the PKI, the communists, they chant. And Gantung Aidit, hang Aidit, the communist leader.
Within a year, hundreds of thousands, possibly millions, were dead. No one actually knows the correct number. It was one of the worst atrocities of the 20th century, and one that few people know about, but its repercussions are still being felt. Oni has brought us to what is now an empty house, a concrete, official-looking building that's been empty for many years. The security guard saying to me that it's haunted. It's here that she was first brought at the age of 17 and interrogated. It's like a haunted house now, isn't it? It's empty, there's no one living there.
Tidak ada orang, tidak ada yang berani. Katanya orang yang pernah.
She says the stories that people say is that when they try and sleep in that area, they hear the voices and sounds of screaming and crying. The ghosts, she thinks, of the women and the men who were tortured here and interrogated here, and their voices are still haunting whoever enters that house now. Okay, we're being told to leave because there's an intelligence agent here. We just tried to walk in there just now, and then we were told to get back into the car. What happened?
Sebenarnya itu banyak yang mengatakan kalau.
She says there's almost an unwritten rule that we can't go back there, so it's illegal in a sense to enter that place and to do what we're doing now. For over 50 years, it's been dangerous to speak about this time. Official history books still don't talk about the mass killings. As I'm finding out, there are many who don't want this dark past dug up, while the victims keep suffering its effects. It's this kind of ongoing impact of the Cold War, 30 years since the fall of the Berlin Wall, which our Compass series is exploring. In our previous episode, Katie Watson was in Brazil examining how today's stark political divisions there echo what happened during the country's 2 decades of military dictatorship. Here in Indonesia, it's the legacy of the 1965 communist purge which still haunts this country.
Baru kelas 1 SMA, 17 tahun.
Jailed as a teenager, Oni came out as a 30-year-old woman. She counted every day, she says. But her identity card marked her and her husband as former political prisoners, traitors that had to be watched. With their movements restricted to their hometown of Yogyakarta in central Java and their job options limited, it wasn't only their lives that were destroyed. Pipit is the youngest of their 4 children.
Kondisi bahwa saya anak dari survivor gitu.
Why weren't we like other families? Why was I different from the other kids? Why didn't I have clothes like the other children? I remember wanting a drawing book, and my mom didn't even have the money for that.
Saya hanya minta untuk sekolah.
I didn't understand why things were like that.
Pipit now has 2 children of her own, but still lives with her parents. Their home is down an alleyway, just wide enough for motorbikes to pass, in a quiet neighbourhood of Yogyakarta. Chickens potter around outside in the little garden her father has created. Her parents kept what happened to them a secret in an attempt to protect her, but that didn't work. Pipit says she remembers being spat at as a kafir or an unbeliever. Alleged communists were labelled, mostly wrongly, as atheists.
Kafir gitu, dan saya pede aja karena saya nggak.
If we were playing and there was a spat with the other children, they would call me kafir. They called me that because my parents were jailed in 1965. Their parents must have passed on the stigma.
Like all her generation, she was forced to watch this graphically violent 4-hour-long government film every year at school. It presents a brutal, dramatised depiction of the alleged 1965 coup by the communists. Daddy! screams the daughter of one of the generals on finding her father's body. She smears her face with his blood as tears run down her cheeks.
Saya habis menonton film dan pelajaran sejarah tentang G30S.
After watching that film, I came home from school and I said to my dad, "Oh, the communists are so evil. They killed the generals." And he just said, "If you are taught that, you just accept that." He didn't tell me anything different.
It wasn't until years later that Pipit realised the direct link to her family.
Saya juga tidak tahu. Saya tahunya itu.
I only really understood in senior high school that father had been labeled a communist. And that's when I became very depressed.
Why did you feel depressed knowing that your father was part of the Communist Party?
Saya merasa langsung kesempatan.
I knew that lots of opportunities were now lost to me. I would never be a government official. When I was little, I really wanted to be a military officer or a police officer. But when I understood I was the child of former political prisoners, all of that was lost to me. And I knew that I would face many challenges.
The children of those labelled communists were banned from holding government jobs until 2004. They're still not welcome in the police or military.
Ada satu buku, jadi di setiap kecamatan.
Pipit says there's a yellow book that records the descendants of the alleged communists, so even her children are still stigmatised. And far from facing justice, those that carried out the massacres have long been hailed as heroes who saved Indonesia from becoming a communist country. It's easy to find someone who's still boastful about their role in committing the killings. We've come to the house of one such man, Burhanuddin. He runs the anti-communist group here in Jogja. He's now in his 70s. Today he's dressed in all white, wearing an Islamic style loose shirt and pants. His grey hair is slicked back. He smiles often as he's welcomed us in. It's a toothy grin that does have quite a sinister edge to it.
Dipercayai oleh TNI, dipersenjatai.
I was trusted by the military to be armed and trained. We were given weapons and given a card that said we had the right to have guns and to kill people. We were given a license to kill, and we joined the operation.
So how many people do you think you killed?
Wah, enggak, saya itu membunuh orang, saya itu enggak itu.
Oh, I can't remember. Too many to count. I didn't count. I was killing people from the end of 1965 till 1967. I would just execute, kill them, and walk away.
It's shocking sitting listening to how casually and proudly he describes killing people. At one point he admits that he has been haunted by the cries of women and children who begged him not to kill their father or husband. But it's a brief moment of remorse, and he quickly shuts it down, and then repeatedly makes it clear he would happily kill again.
All weather, siap saat saya siap menghadapi mereka, kapanpun dimanapun.
I'm always ready, at any time, in any weather. I would be delighted if they try and come back, as then we would have an excuse to really wipe them out. They will be executed, finished.
Years ago, there was an attempt by the current President Joko Widodo to open up this dark chapter in Indonesia. There was even talk of digging up mass graves and of an official apology offered for the mass killings. But this angered and unsettled many in the military and the political elite, as well as Muslim organisations that had taken part in the purge. Before I left the house of self-confessed killer Burhan, he makes his views clear on the president's reconciliation attempts.
Saya yang akan menghadapi langsung di hadapan dia. Salah kamu.
Burhan said that if the government apologizes, if the president has the audacity to apologize for the mass killings in 1965, he will be the first that will go to the presidential palace and confront the president and threatens directly to kill him. It was this level of intense backlash that shut down the process completely.
Even I, who have been believing in the concept of reconciliation, I see now that the society is not yet ready to reconcile. So I do not push. My name is Agus Wijoyo. I'm a retired Lieutenant General, and my occupation is the Governor of the National Resilience Institute of the Republic of Indonesia.
His father was one of the generals killed during the alleged coup on the 30th of September 1965, and he led the military delegation in the failed truth-telling and reconciliation process 3 years ago. He blames the leftists for only playing the victim as he sees it and not wanting to admit to their own human rights abuses, including a localized armed uprising in 1948.
The leftist side, when they talk about 1965, it was always putting themselves and sometimes glorifying themselves as victims. They never said anything about the Indonesian Communist Party before 1965, and that actually there were killings also by the Indonesian Communist Party that was done before 65, and also massive, 1948, the way that pushed for their policies in a forceful way, one. Secondly, from the other side, from the government and military side, it was a sort of a mindset that the state can do no wrong.
So the military is frightened to be held accountable?
I ask on the opposite. So the communists, are they afraid that all things about the Communist Party would be open before 1965?
This, coming from a moderate reformist figure in the military, shows just how deep the divisions are. The Communist Party is still banned in Indonesia. Students have even been detained for just wearing heavy metal t-shirts with what they didn't know were communist symbols on them. And these kinds of arrests are less surprising than it seems, as I realised when Agus Wijoyo made an extraordinary admission that the communist threat is being kept alive for a reason.
The myth against communism as the latent danger has a value to enforce that there is a need also not to forget about Islam. If a sense of communism dies, then the sense or urge to have a feeling of the importance of religion in the society can also diminish.
So you're saying that the threat of communism is being kept alive for a political purpose?
A sort of, because it can be easily transformed into other interests.
Children are still not taught about the mass killings in schools. There are no details about them in the official history books, only that the Communist Party was wiped out after an attempted coup. But on the internet, groups are breaking the silence, providing alternative sources of knowledge for those willing to seek it. We're in a small apartment in the centre of Jakarta that looks out over the sprawling metropolis, and the evening call to prayer is ringing out from the nearby mosque. And around the small kitchen table here are the members of Ingat 65 or Remember 65.
Hello, my name is Prodita Sabarini. I'm one of the initiators of Ingat 65, and that's a digital storytelling movement for young people in Indonesia to tell their stories and reflection about what happened in 1965 in Indonesia.
Ingat 65 is a website run by a group of young journalists.
I hope that it can become a space for the young people born after 65 to share their stories about their family, about their communities, and how 1965 affected their lives. The young people, because they started to find out about 1965, have something to say about it. They want the country to continue talking and have a truth-telling process in Indonesia, or maybe they want a reconciliation process, or maybe they want justice, who knows. But Ingat 65 is a space for the young generation to join the conversation about 1965.
It's not an easy task for these young journalists given the current climate. Since the failed reconciliation attempt, views have, if anything, hardened. Meetings of survivors and screenings of documentary films about the killings have been shut down by vigilante groups.
Bisa seperti itu, bisa juga bahkan kayak feature film gitu, kayak fiksi.
They've been talking about the fact that it's quite a frightening time at the moment. When they set up this group back in 2015, things were very different. There was a sense of optimism that this period of history would finally be told. But now their authors and the people they asked to contribute to their website are too frightened now to do that. And they can no longer expect people to use their real names, their photos. So they say now they have to be more creative. They're talking about the possibility of using comics or illustrations to get around this new sense of intimidation that's hanging over Indonesia at the moment.
Back in 2015, I feel that there's nothing to be afraid of. Now the situation is different. The president once said that he would gebuk PKI, which translate as I would smash the communists. And people who are speaking about the issue of 1965, they would be labeled as communist. So our group has been labeled as neo-communists. And then that becomes scary.
Some will say Indonesia faces so many problems at the moment, and 65 is a long time ago. Those mass killings, why waste energy digging up the past and dividing the country again?
Well, I think because of the violence that happened in 1965 and that the wrongdoing was never addressed, I feel like Indonesia is undergoing the same cycle of violence over and over again.
The concern about ongoing impunity is something that also worries Agus Wijojo, the retired Lieutenant General.
Dendam itu akan dibawa terus ke masa depan.
Before I left him, he told me in Indonesian that he knows this dark chapter in Indonesia's history has to be dealt with. Otherwise, the divisions will continue to haunt us. He says, if we don't learn from the mistakes of the past, they will only be repeated. Back in Yogyakarta, Pipit, the daughter of the purge survivors, has been on a personal journey of healing after finally understanding as an adult what happened to her mom and dad.
Saya mengantar bapak ke pertemuan itu dan
My father's friends told me what had happened to my parents, and instead of blaming them, I finally understood what had taken place. I understood that they were victims, and that there were many people that suffered the same fate.
And your father says that you now call him a survivor, which he finds quite funny.
Iya. Iya, memang bapak saya seorang ini sih.
Oh yeah, my father is a fighter. He is incredible.
So you're proud of him?
Jelas. Itu saya mulai menyadari bahwa
I'm very proud. That's when I realized that I should be so proud that I'm the daughter of my dad and my mom.
Now Pipit works to make sure the next generation isn't raised in the same cloud of ignorance.
Agenda hari ini adalah agenda kita mau ngobrol tentang jaga-jaga.
Pipit and her mother join this meeting every week that's taking place in an old Javanese house. It's a chance for young university students to come here and hear the stories firsthand from survivors of the communist purge. They're sitting in a circle on woven mats, and on one side is Pipit's mother and 6 other women who were jailed for years without trial, and on the other side are the university students eagerly listening to their stories. Tata is one of the students here.
When I talk to my friends, they have no idea about these alternative stories, so it's a big job and hard job to distribute these other stories.
Because people were still taught the official narrative, which effectively denies that these mass killings and imprisonment without trial of thousands of people took place.
Yes, most of them just don't know because, who got to write the stories is the winner of the war.
Do you feel as if for so many years you were effectively lied to?
Yeah, then I don't know what's true and what's wrong,
Apa sebelum 65 dan setelah 65?
One of the young men just asked, can you tell me what you had before 1965 that you lost? And the woman opposite him said, my husband. I had the love of my life before 1965. After, he was taken from me.
Tadinya saya tinggal di Kesuman.
These kind of discussions about a history that happened over 50 years ago are still very rare in Indonesia and come with a sense of danger and stigma. But Oni says it feels amazing to be able to hold these meetings.
Oh iya, sama anak muda mahasiswa itu. Iya.
I used to be frightened to tell my story, to sit and to talk to students. But now I'm free, I'm very brave, and I want to tell my story. I love to tell my story, and that's what I see as important now, to teach the next generation what happened. I'm brave now.
At the end of the gathering, Oni and the other women sing and dance together. They do so proudly, smiling at each other as they sway their hips in unison. I asked them if they want to sing the song Oni was jailed for, Genje Genje, that became identified with the Communist Party and was banned along with it. We'll have to sing it quietly, they tell me, still very sensitive. But then joke that they will, though, be singing loudly in their hearts. Indonesia, like these women, remains haunted by the Cold War legacy. The brutal communist purge changed this country forever. It lost a generation of its brightest and most creative minds. And with the killers still exalted as heroes, a culture of impunity continues to exist for the military elite. But while it's unlikely official history books will ever tell the full horror of what happened in 1965, there are now many who are bravely breaking down the walls of silence. Indonesia's Cold War legacy was presented by me, Rebecca Henschke. The producer was Arlene Gregorius. In the next episode, Divya Arya will be reporting on how India fought not to take sides in the Cold War, but instead played off one bloc against the other.
The evidence explores the science of the current pandemic. Here's Claudia Hammond.
We are looking at the global picture of COVID-19. With China loosening their restrictions and many other countries embarking on lockdowns, we'll ask our panel of guests some straight questions about what we're learning about how to stay safe, new drug treatments, living in isolation, and even the virus itself.
The evidence at bbcworldservice.com. Hello and a warm welcome to the BBC World Service. As you know, there's a lack of live sport going on in the world at the moment, and now in a change to our schedule, we answer questions on a variety of aspects of COVID-19, including the impact of lockdowns and self-isolation on the spread of the virus. This is the BBC World Service, the world's radio station.
Hello, I'm
I'm Claudia Hammond. With much of the world in lockdown, you are no doubt hearing a lot about the coronavirus. And you might also be wondering, how come and what if? So every 2 weeks in the evidence on the BBC World Service, we have a panel of scientists and other experts who've been involved in trying to stop the spread of the virus or in helping us to cope with it.
But it's incredibly important that people understand that the virus can still stick to the outside of this mask. In fact, there was some recent research that showed viruses can actually survive for up to a week on the surface of surgical masks. So if you're taking those off incorrectly, if you're touching them with your hands and not washing your hands, or if you're reusing these masks often, then you could actually be putting yourself at more risk of infecting yourself.
I'm hoping that many of my questions will be the ones you have in your minds too, but we're also putting some of your specific questions to our panel. So do join me for the evidence after the BBC News.
Hello, I'm David Harper with the BBC News. Hundreds of millions of people across India have switched off their electric lights and lit lamps and candles for 9 minutes to show solidarity in the fight against the coronavirus. The gesture, which some critics dismissed as a gimmick, was called for by the Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi. Divya Arya was watching from her balcony in Delhi.
Completely dark out there, and lots of mobile torches being flashed, lots of oil lamps. In fact, the exuberance was so much that there were firecrackers being burst. There were also slogans being shouted of Hail Mother India. And that's not just happened in my neighborhood, but across the country. I've been looking at reports coming from different parts of the country, similar things, fireworks and conch playing, which is a very symbolic Hindu tradition of announcing victory, and slogans of Hail Mother India.
Spain has fined more than 300,000 people for flouting coronavirus restrictions that began 3 weeks ago. The Interior Minister, Fernando Grande Marlaska, said 2,850 people had been arrested. He said police had carried out more than 3 million checks on vehicles and people. For the third day running, the number of new coronavirus deaths in Spain has fallen, this time to well below 700. Tuscany is the latest province in northern Italy to make it obligatory for residents to wear a face mask when leaving their homes. The governor of Tuscany, Enrico Rossi, said he decided to distribute 10 million masks for free to Tuscans and would later make available another 10 million. The neighbouring region of Lombardy, which has been hardest hit by the virus, is already enforcing a similar rule, along with the Veneto and Alto Adige. In Milan, this resident said she was resigned to wearing a mask.
Non sono un medico. Io mi attengo alle regole che vengono.
I'm not a doctor, I stick to the rules. The real problem is confusion. Nobody knows anything about the virus because it's the first time we're dealing with it. I wish politicians were clearer when taking decisions.
The Chief Medical Officer for Scotland has been removed from the coronavirus public information campaign for flouting the rules she promotes. Police issued a warning to Catherine Calderwood after it emerged that she'd ignored her own coronavirus advice to avoid travel. This report from Alexandra Mackenzie.
The Chief Medical Officer has attended the daily COVID-19 briefings in Edinburgh alongside the First Minister. Their advice was to stay at home to help save lives and not travel to holiday homes. But today the Scottish Sun published photographs of Catherine Calderwood at her second home in Fife. Scotland's CMO said she knew how important the advice was and didn't want her mistake to distract from that.
Alexandra Mackenzie reporting. World news from the BBC. Bahrain has introduced electronic tags to monitor quarantined and self-isolating COVID-19 cases. The white gadget, which is very similar to a wristwatch, is linked to a smartphone using an app which monitors the person's location and vital signs. A key figure in the overthrow of the Libyan dictator Colonel Muammar Gaddafi has died of the coronavirus. Mahmoud Jibril, who was 67, had been suffering from heart problems. Yusuf Taha looks back at his life.
Mr. Jibril had been an influential figure in the Gaddafi regime, but he claimed he had little choice. During the rebellion against Mr. Gaddafi, he headed an interim government. He said he would resign from office once Libya had been liberated, and he did so 3 days after the dictator was captured and killed in October 2011. Mr. Jibril was seen as a potential future leader in post-Gaddafi Libya, but a new law banned former Gaddafi officials from running for public office. Mr. Jibril's National Forces Alliance led in Libya's 2012 election, the first democratic poll to be held in decades.
State television channels in Morocco have been attracting record audiences since the coronavirus lockdown began 2 weeks ago in the North African country. Research shows figures have gone up from 2 million to 4.25 million for primetime Arabic language bulletins. Many viewers reportedly believe the broadcasters have risen to the challenge of keeping them informed as well as entertained, all the more so because they have hosted health specialists as well as senior government officials. A South African couple on honeymoon have been left stranded on an island in the Maldives after the coronavirus outbreak prevented them from returning home. Olivia and Raoul de Freitas are now the only guests remaining at their five-star island resort in the Indian Ocean, and they're worried they'll be bankrupted if the lockdown continues. Mr. de Freitas told the New York Times everyone thought that they wanted to be stuck on a tropical island until it actually happened. That's the latest BBC News.
Hello and welcome to The Evidence from the BBC World Service. I'm Claudia Hammond, and every 2 weeks we're spending almost an hour discussing the best evidence we have about the coronavirus and its impact on the world. This show is produced in collaboration with Wellcome Collection, and we broadcast in front of audiences in Hong Kong, Vietnam and South Africa. But now, of course, for safety, each of our panel of experts is in their own homes wherever they live in the world, and we have questions which some of you have sent in. Now, this is a chance for us to look in depth at a virus that is causing a great deal of uncertainty and anxiety, and to get to the facts as we know them. Now, the world is changing very fast, and approaches to public health that were considered unthinkable in many parts of the world are now commonplace, such as closing schools, airports, shops and public transport, and demanding that people stay indoors. Meanwhile, hospitals are being built in record time, but many existing hospitals are overwhelmed. Later on, we'll hear about the psychological impact on medical staff in Italy who are witnessing situations they never thought they would see. And why have so many parts of the world not yet put into place the testing which the WHO has said is so crucial in dealing with this outbreak? Now, in this week's evidence, we want to look at what we know about the virus and the immune system, why it can cause mild or even no symptoms in some people, and yet is so very dangerous for others. And as more people become infected, is the stigma around the disease changing? Now, joining me this week are Professor Vivek Jha, the Executive Director of the George Institute for Global Health, India, Dr. Lindsay Broadbent, a virologist at Queen's University Belfast, and Christos Linteris, a medical anthropologist from St Andrews University. Thank you so much to all of you for joining us. Now, let's start by talking about lockdowns. Now, the exact rules vary in different countries, but it is extraordinary to think that now more than 3 billion people around the world are now largely confined to their homes, with Nigeria, Russia, South Africa and India some of the most recent countries to take this action. Now, Vivek, the lockdown in India happened so fast that President Modi has even apologised for the harshness of the lockdown and the impact on poorer people in particular. Some have called it a new humanitarian crisis. What has happened in India, and could India have handled it differently, do you think?
As you notice, here in India, we had the lockdown come pretty fast. It was announced at 8 o'clock in the evening, and the lockdown went into effect at midnight. And so people really had no time to prepare. I guess the reason for this was apparently to avoid panic and to prevent people from trying to go to the shops and start holding supplies. But in effect, what it did to people who work in unorganized sectors, especially rural migrants who come to cities, suddenly they were not only out of a job, but they didn't have any place to live in. They didn't have any food to eat. And so they had no way but to try to find their way home. They didn't have any assistance coming their way from the authorities. And we've heard stories of people suffering severe hardships. Sometimes when they reached their villages or their towns, they were not allowed to enter the boundary because they were thought to have come from potentially COVID-infected area, leading to additional hardships that they suffered. So this is indeed a big humanitarian crisis, potentially being compared to the big migration that took place at the time of India's independence, when India, at that time, the British India was divided into India and Pakistan, and millions of people migrated from one part of India to another. In addition to that, there have been hardships to other people with other pre-existing chronic diseases Suddenly, they are unable to access healthcare, which is causing big trouble to all of these people.
So it can result in very harsh situations, and of course the idea is to stop the transmission of the virus. Lindsay, it can take a while, can't it, before a lockdown affects what we actually see happening. How soon after a country has imposed these sorts of restrictions do you expect to see a difference in the transmission of the virus?
It will really take 2 to 3 weeks to see any difference. The incubation period of this virus is anywhere between 2 days and 2 weeks, with an average of about 5 days. So a lot of the people that are in lockdown now, in countries that have only established lockdown, may have been infected before those measures were put in place. So as I said, it will take 2 to 3 weeks post lockdown to see those numbers start to decrease.
And of course, as some countries are going into lockdown, others like China are gradually coming out of isolation. Now, Christos, you've worked extensively in China. What are you hearing about how people are reacting to the lifting of the quite severe restrictions there?
As you know, information from China is rather controlled, so it's difficult to know exactly what's happening while not being on the ground. From what we hear, there has been a gradual lifting in several regions. We hear that restrictions in Wuhan will be lifted on April the 8th. Now, this is not a strategy without a risk, because, as you will remember, the Wuhan lockdown was imposed on the 23rd of January, and one of the reasons this happened then was because this was close to the beginning of the celebration of the Chinese New Year, which signals perhaps the biggest internal migration across the globe. So the lockdown of Wuhan was not just about Wuhan, it was about a much broader flow of population across China. Now, on April 4th, we have another major festival in China. It's not one that sees as great a movement of people as the New Year, but it does see quite a few people moving around. That's the Qingming festival, which is when people go and visit their ancestors' graves. Very important festival. So this gradual lifting of measures before the Qingming festival is quite a challenge, I think, for China. But it is also something which presumably allow people to go and venerate their ancestors' graves, which is something of great symbolic significance at the moment, especially given how many people have died.
And of course, the countries that are beginning their lockdowns will be looking very carefully to see what happens in China as people emerge from theirs. And I want to come back to India for a moment. Vivek, we've heard how the lockdown was imposed at very short notice, but do we know how many cases of COVID-19 there are in the country?
The number of COVID-19 cases is increasing now, and almost every day the number is rising more than the previous day. So the number of cases is rising rapidly. There are a few hotspots that have been identified, especially one in which there was a large religious congregation in New Delhi, in which we had visitors coming from many countries, and they stayed there for several days, cramped several hundred in a very small mosque, and then they dispersed into various locations in the country, and it appears that there was a coronavirus outbreak seeded by someone or some people who came to that religious gathering.
How well prepared is India to deal with some of the basics, such as the advice we've all been having to wash your hands very thoroughly and to wash them for long enough?
So washing hands is a luxury for a large proportion of Indian population who do not have access to running water, do not have access to soap. India has great diversity in its population, so people who are rich and people who are in the middle class are able to observe all these admonitions that have been given. But people who belong to poor communities, such as the landless laborers and the migrants who are at this time walking from one place to another, clearly don't have access to these facilities. So for them to be able to observe any kind of hand washing is simply asking for too much.
And Lindsay, how much difference does it make if you can't wash your hands easily? How quickly can the virus replicate on your skin and move to infect you?
Yes, the virus can survive on your hands for a while, and if you then touch your face, that is the main route of transmission. However, in countries that don't have access to the type of cleaning facilities and soap and clean running water that are needed social distancing certainly plays an incredibly important role in those countries.
And Vivek, how difficult is that sort of social distancing going to be in India? If people live in cramped conditions or don't have a home, how is that going to be possible in India?
The simple answer is that it is not going to be possible. India is home to very large slums where people live cheek by jowl in a small room. And again, these people who are moving right now from one place to another, they are sometimes being boarded in buses in large numbers. So clearly, these people are not able to observe social distancing.
So, Lindsay, does the severity of a person's symptoms depend on how much virus gets into their body? So if they are packed somewhere where there are lots of people who may already have infections, does that put them at more risk? Is that why medical staff, for example, are at more risk?
There is a lot of research being done in this area at the minute. The research isn't certain whether the amount of virus that initially infects a person correlates with the severity, but as you mentioned, that could be one reason why healthcare workers seem to be at such higher risk. But what we do know is that the viral load that a person is secreting does correlate with how severe their symptoms will be.
And there are some reports, Lindsay, of people getting ill, then thinking they're a bit better, and then getting much worse again. Do we know why the virus can act like that?
You're quite right. It seems to be that people seem to get mild symptoms, they feel better for a few days, and that's when the breathing difficulties start. And this is possibly due to the immune response of the body, that the initial symptoms are caused by that initial infection, the upper respiratory tract infection. And then if that isn't cleared effectively, that's when you go on to develop some more severe symptoms, which are actually driven by the body's own immune response and not actually by the virus itself.
And that's interesting because that fits in with a question from Manu Herbstein, who's from Accra in Ghana. And he says, what motivates viruses? If COVID-19 virus were to infect him, what would the virus gain by infecting somebody so badly that it killed them? What does the virus actually want here?
So viruses themselves aren't actually alive. They don't really have an ability to think or drive what their end purpose is. All they do is replicate. So a good virus is able to replicate over and over again and produce lots more viruses. They do not want to kill their host. A virus that kills its host is actually an incredibly bad virus. The virus wants the host to survive, and the longer they survive, the more progeny virus that they will produce.
So it sounds as though the most severe symptoms of all are caused by the body's reaction to the virus rather than the virus itself.
Yes, it's an active immune response. This is why it varies so much between people, because people's immune responses are incredibly different, and that's down to mostly your genetics, your lifestyle, environmental factors. They can all influence how your immune system responds to any pathogen, including this virus, and that varies greatly, and that's one of the avenues of research and treatment options at the minute, to target the actual immune response as opposed to targeting the virus itself.
So what sorts of lifestyle actions could be helpful?
It really healthy, varied diet, plenty of sleep, drinking plenty, not smoking, really those general everyday things that you hear about to lead a healthy life make your immune system be as good as they can.
And we'll talk more in the second part of the programme about how to find treatments for COVID-19. But does this way that the immune system behaves, could that give us a clue to finding treatments? Is it about trying to get the immune system to stop misbehaving, if you like?
Absolutely. And the best treatments, I think, will be a two-pronged attack. One, to limit the amount of virus in a person's body and to get rid of that virus. And then along with that, to limit the immune response and dampen down the immune response from that infection. And if we can do both of those at the same time, then we could really find a fantastic treatment for COVID-19.
And I have some more listener questions I want to put to you. Vivek, let me ask you this one. David Panone from Seattle in the US says he can't remember anything like this that has disrupted so much of the world before. Why has COVID-19 become more serious than, say, the SARS or MERS outbreaks that we saw in the past?
That's the question that everyone is asking right now. Even though these viruses were more dangerous in terms of their lethality, it's COVID which actually is much more contagious compared to these two other viruses. And so it's going from person to person very quickly. It also has a relatively longer incubation period, which allows an asymptomatic person to be able to transmit this infection to other people without everyone realizing that there are asymptomatic people who are shedding this virus amongst them.
Christos, would you compare this outbreak to any other outbreaks or huge disruptions to the world in the past?
As far as China goes, this is definitely comparable to SARS. Extensive lockdowns did happen in China during SARS in 2003. So anyone who is an adult today, this would be their second experience in many cases of a lockdown.
And as a medical anthropologist, you've looked at how the media has represented different epidemics historically. And I mean, nowadays there's this image of the coronavirus, the actual virus itself, that is used all the time. Is that kind of image helpful, do you think?
Well, I think this is a staple of representations of epidemics as far back as the Third Plague Pandemic in 1894. It is, I think, largely symbolic, largely meant to connote that science is in control of the situation, which is generally speaking a good thing, I think.
And I guess the other thing we see in many countries in TV and newspaper reports are, at the moment, pictures of empty streets and people's in masks, doctors in protective gear and hospitals in disarray. Could there be a different way, do you think, of portraying what's going on that could help people understand better what's happening?
I think what would be welcome would be to replace these rather stereotypical images, which again very much repeat the tropes developed at the beginning of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century under very colonial conditions, and replace these images of every epidemic since the beginning of the 20th century with images which are more community-driven. What we need is more images from the ground, from the people who are going through this. And these images do exist on social media, but they're not necessarily the ones that are reproduced by the media.
What kind of things would you show then?
Well, you'd have pictures from home. As you say, there has never been so many people in confinement, so that the most unprecedented characteristic of this pandemic is these great numbers of people having to stay at home.
And there have been cases in various countries around the world where people are filming themselves in hospitals with their phones to try to warn others about what might happen, to try to get others to stay safe. Is that a good thing?
Well, that's an interesting phenomenon. It raises interesting questions of medical ethics, because of course when you're filming patients, you don't necessarily have their informed consent, so that's very problematic. And there are also cases of videos on social media which cannot be verified. This opens up a really big question with regards to the visual image of a pandemic in real time this time.
And the other thing we've seen a lot of is people in various places raiding supermarkets. Do you think that panics others into doing that, to sort of think, oh, this is the scary future where what we need to do is go and grab food and hoard it?
Well, this is kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy, really. We've had for many years movies about pandemics where the image of people looting supermarkets, etc., has been an indispensable kind of part of these movies. And humans are rather mimetic animals, if you like. So there is a danger there that we have created the ground where stockpiling or behaving in such a way in supermarkets is seen as the normal thing to do under an emergency, which actually, if you look at history, that's not the case at all. That's not how people behave in times of epidemics. Usually people come together at time of epidemics. Societies do not fall apart.
And Vivek, what kind of influence do you think it will have had in India, that people may have seen pictures from other parts of the world and seen what's happening and what's going to happen? Has that affected people's behaviour, would you say?
Indeed, I think news from around the world, including pictures, has severely influenced people's views about what is possibly going to happen if the virus spreads in the country. We have seen images as well as, for example, those pictures circulating on social media, which is so common in India these days, and a number of them can in fact mislead also and provide wrong kind of information. So people are quite distressed by those images. Some of them reinforce people's sense of fear and forces them to take appropriate steps which have been advised, such as maintaining social distancing, appropriate hand hygiene, and so on and so forth. But on the other hand, sometimes when people are locked down in their own ecosystem and they recycle messages which just reaffirm their own point of view, in that case, it can prove to be perhaps a malign influence as well.
And one of the things people might be looking for is answers, and we have time for just a few more of your questions before the news. Vivek, this one for you. Jeannie Crowson asks, she says, I'm in the elderly with an underlying condition category. Is there any evidence about how people in this group can be treated successfully, or am I to abandon hope if I fall sick with it?
Of course not. I think there are a lot more people in this age group actually survive the COVID infection than succumb to it. So more than 4 out of 5 people over the age of 80 who have this infection will survive. And the right thing for people with this infection is to actually consult a doctor at the right time. The way it can actually kill people is through extensive immune response when the lungs get flooded with fluid and with cells and increasing the body's oxygen supply. So ensuring enough oxygenation in the body, either through initial stages through just oxygen, supplemental oxygen, and later on, if needed, through ventilators, will allow more than 4 out of 5 patients, even above the age of 80, to pull through.
And Lindsay, there's another interesting question here from Anne Shepherd, who says she's 74. She says, a few years ago I was vaccinated against pneumonia. I know this vaccination doesn't protect me from catching the new coronavirus, but what she'd like to know is whether it would protect her from developing pneumonia as a consequence of catching the new coronavirus and therefore reduce her risk of dying from it. What would you say to that, Lindsay?
So there are two main types of pneumonia. There's viral pneumonia and then there's bacterial pneumonia. The vaccine that people receive is against bacterial pneumonia, whereas the SARS-CoV-2 virus can cause pneumonia itself, and that's a viral type of pneumonia. So while the vaccine won't prevent you from developing pneumonia caused by this virus, what it can do is prevent you getting a secondary bacterial infection of the type of bacteria that you're vaccinated against. And that is incredibly important because secondary bacterial infections increase the risk of people having severe disease and dying from this. So if you're able to get a pneumococcal vaccine, your pneumonia vaccine, I would encourage everyone to do that if they're recommended for it. It also takes added strain off the health services because they do not need to be dealing with pneumonia cases that could have been prevented at a time when really all resources need to be focused on COVID-19 cases.
And so this secondary pneumonia would also be the reason why some people who are being treated are being given antibiotics, even though we know antibiotics only work against bacteria and not against viruses.
Yes, absolutely. There are some bacteria that will just take advantage of the situation of someone that is ill, and they will infect you in addition to being infected with the virus, and that does seem to prove to be much more fatal than the virus itself.
And Vivek, here's a question for you. This is from Edoardo Brunetti from Rome in Italy. And he says, Italy and Japan both have high numbers of older people, and yet Japan has had far fewer deaths than Italy. Do we know why that is?
Well, that's an interesting question. Everyone is trying to figure out why people in some countries have done better than people in some other countries. In Japan, the general wisdom is that it is because of their society and the way people behave with each other. So already there is a fair amount of, you can say, social distancing that takes place in Japan, and people don't have habits of, for example, shaking hands. They bow to each other, and so it is felt that that might have been responsible in limiting the spread of infection.
Well, thank you for all those questions, and thank you for the moment to Vivek Jar, Lindsay Broadbent and Christos Linteris. Now, after the news, we'll find out more about testing for the virus and why it's proving a sticking point for so many governments, and how best to trial new drugs to see whether they work. I'm Claudia Hammond. Do join me for the second part of The Evidence from the BBC.
You're listening to the BBC World Service, keeping you up to date and informed.
We still don't know how long this COVID-19 fight will continue.
Right now, life is changing for all of us around the globe.
Challenging times are ahead. Don't drop your guard.
Here at the BBC World Service, we're bringing you regular roundups on the spread and implications of the coronavirus.
Medical staff will need about 89 million medical masks and 76 million gloves each month.
We have all the latest medical information, news of work towards a treatment, and reports from the affected areas.
I think that there is an enormous feeling in our country that we want to do the right thing.
The global effects on health, business, sport, and travel.
The priority of our government is the health and well-being of our people.
Here on the BBC World Service.
Hello, I'm Claudia Hammond, and in a moment I'll be back with the evidence from the BBC, where we're focusing on the coronavirus. After the news, we'll be discussing whether more testing would make a difference, and hearing from Italy about the psychological strains on doctors and nurses caring for the dying. How best to trial new drugs, and now that more people are infected, is the stigma of having COVID-19 changing? Do join me and my panel of very knowledgeable guests for the evidence after the BBC News.
BBC News with David Harper. Hundreds of millions of people across India have switched off their electric lights and lit lamps and candles to show solidarity in the fight against the coronavirus. The gesture, which lasted for 9 minutes, was called for by the Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi, but it was criticised as a gimmick. Spain has fined more than 300,000 people for flouting coronavirus restrictions that began 3 weeks ago. The Interior Minister said police had carried out more than 3 million checks on vehicles and people. Several thousand have been arrested. The number of coronavirus deaths has fallen for the third day running. The number of people in Britain who've died after testing positive for the coronavirus has risen by 621, slightly down on the previous day. The total since the start of the outbreak now stands at nearly 5,000. The Health Secretary for England warned the government may ban outdoor exercise if people continue to ignore the rules about social distancing. Scotland's chief medical officer has been removed from the coronavirus public information campaign for flouting the rules she promotes. Police issued a warning to Catherine Calderwood after it emerged that she'd driven 70 kilometres from Edinburgh to the family's country home in Fife 2 weekends running, despite government advice not to travel. A key figure in the overthrow of the Libyan dictator Colonel Gaddafi has died of the coronavirus. Mahmoud Jibril was 67. He'd been an influential figure in the Gaddafi regime, but claimed he'd had little choice. A man who got lost while crossing from France into Spain to buy cheap cigarettes has been rescued by emergency services in the Pyrenees and given a fine for breaking anti-coronavirus rules. After he was safely brought back, he was given a fine for breaking France's lockdown regulations, which say you can only leave your home for essential reasons. Live from London, that's the latest BBC News.
Welcome back to the evidence on the BBC World Service with me, Claudia Hammond, where we have a panel of guests who are very knowledgeable about the coronavirus and its impact. They are Vivek Jha, Lindsay Broadbent and Christos Linteris, and they're here to give straightforward answers to some of the questions we've all been wondering about in this strange new world we find ourselves in. In this half of the show, we're going to talk about testing for the virus and the best way of discovering new drugs to treat the infection. But I want for a moment to focus on the psychological toll on doctors and nurses in countries such as Italy, who are trying to save some very sick patients. We were talking earlier about some of the main images linked to the pandemic, and people might have seen pictures of hospitals in Italy overwhelmed with patients and doctors and nurses there with their faces that are red raw from wearing protective masks. Working in such conditions and seeing so many patients die is taking its toll on medical staff. Sara Tossato is a psychiatrist at the University of Verona in northern Italy, which has taken the brunt of cases in the country, and she told me about some of the most serious consequences for doctors and nurses.
In Italy, we have some cases of nurses or doctors who have attempted suicide, which is the most serious consequences of psychological distress. To avoid this, our hospital and the majority of hospitals in Italy has organized specific psychological support for healthcare staff.
And are you finding that healthcare staff are taking you and other hospitals up on that offer of psychological support?
Yeah, they can book an appointment to discuss their feeling, their difficulties, and to receive the advice how to cope with the problems. But the staff can ask also advice regarding how they can communicate with the families. And sometimes have also to communicate the bad news of the death.
I see. So will the doctors phone the families to tell them that, or do the families go into the hospital?
Unfortunately, this is very sad. The patient is completely isolated in the hospital. So the communication between the patient and the family is sometimes very difficult. So the nurses and the doctor are very aware and try to do all the best. And sometimes also some people from the general population donate phone or tablet to the hospital to support this kind of communication between the patient and the families. But in other case, the staff should cope with the communication of bad news by phone to the families. And they ask for advice or for support to psychologists or psychiatrists.
And for the medical staff, obviously nurses and doctors are used to stressful situations already, but what is so different about the situation that is facing them each day now when they go to work?
Doctors now have a huge and stressed workload because they spend a lot of hours, 12 or sometimes more, at the hospital taking care of patients. And they are also concerned about being able to infect their loved ones. Some of them have made, for example, the choice to live in a hotel. They have no more the support of their family, so they are stressed for that.
Yes, that must make it harder if they then can't go home and see their families as well.
And also it is stressful because you have also to wear mask and personal protection, and you spend time to change dressing mask between one patient to the other one, and you are concerned that you can be infected.
Yeah, so it's a lot of different things for people to deal with in that situation, and I guess they're having to make difficult life and death decisions as well.
Yes, even if here in Verona, but in a lot of hospitals, we worked very hard to have more beds in the intensive care unit. So we try to give all the patients a possibility to receive the best care.
Now, as Sara Tosato says, staff have been having a really difficult time there in Italy. Christos, have we ever seen such terrible impacts on medical staff in previous epidemics? I'm thinking about SARS maybe, or even going back much further, Spanish flu.
Yes, absolutely. We've seen this in most epidemics and pandemics, such as the third plague pandemic or the flu pandemic of 1918, or indeed SARS in the regions which was where it was very severe and prevalent, such as Hong Kong. It's always the case that doctors, nurses, and health staff would be very, very much in danger, and they are at the forefront of this fight against the pandemic. They're the most important people in this story.
Absolutely, and Vivek, this must be a very dreadful thing for doctors and nurses to live through. Are your colleagues in India watching to see what might be coming down the line to them, watching nervously maybe?
Indeed, there is a great deal of nervousness. People are worried about what might happen to them. This is especially important because the personal protective equipment that might be required in case there is a sudden upsurge in the number of cases is just not there at this particular point of time. So there is clearly a great deal of anxiety, and people are desperately trying to look for measures by which they can protect themselves, including taking recourse to some yet unproven remedies.
What protection do frontline healthcare workers have at the moment?
Well, at this time, they don't have anything apart from what is being provided to them by the healthcare system. In some cases, they have masks and maybe some simple gowns, but they don't have the kind of elaborate personal protective equipment that have been advised. They are being reserved for people in specialized hospitals where COVID-infected patients with more severe infections who are likely to be spreading the virus much more abundantly are going to come. But even there, if the number of cases increases substantially and large number of healthcare workers are forced to be pressed into action, there is a risk of the hospitals running out of these supplies.
Now, of course, having the right equipment to protect themselves is absolutely essential for medical staff. But when it comes to everyone else, I mean, Christos, there's been quite a lot of controversy over the wearing of masks and how good they are in either stopping transmitting the virus to someone else or in not catching it yourself. But I was interested to see in your work that in China and many Asian countries, wearing a mask can be seen as something of a sign of solidarity. How is it viewed?
Well, I think that the mask in China in particular has a very different history from the one in the West. In China, the epidemic mask emerged in 1910 as part of a very, very serious effort against pneumonic plague. It was actually invented in China for that purpose, and then it continued being used across the different regimes that China has seen, all the way to SARS, when saw a very massive use, especially in Hong Kong, but also in other parts of China. And since 2003, it became kind of an everyday accessory, something you would wear against pollution or dust or the common cold, indeed. Well, the masks that people would wear are not necessarily the best to protect them from viral infections, but the wearing of masks is something which is seen as much more of an everyday thing. And it is, in the context of epidemics, also something which shows that, let's say, society can go on, right? It is something that shows that although we need to create physical distancing, this is not necessarily social distancing. I think the term social distancing, in fact, is a very, very bad term to describe this. What we need is physical distancing, but we need to maintain social cohesion and social interaction for our societies to continue to work and come out unharmed in a social sense after the end of this epidemic.
Now, Austria has just made it compulsory to wear masks when people go shopping. Lindsay, what do we know about whether this will actually stop the spread, or is it just more of a sense of something that gives you a sense of solidarity, like Christos says?
The evidence behind how protective the normal surgical style masks are is quite uncertain at the minute. And as we discussed, a lot of these infections can be asymptomatic. So in that sense, these masks may provide some protection. But it's incredibly important that people understand that the virus can still stick to the outside of this mask. In fact, there was some recent research that showed viruses can actually survive for up to a week on the surface of surgical masks. So if you're taking those off incorrectly, if you're touching them with your hands and not washing your hands, or if you're reusing these masks often, then you could actually be putting yourself at more risk of infecting yourself.
Now, we have some more questions for you, Lindsay, on the spread of the virus, and these all come from a listener called Tom. And so I thought perhaps we could do them quick fire. You're allowed to answer just yes or no if you want to, but some of them may need more detail. What if you have cuts on your hands? Can you catch the virus through those cuts?
No.
Should you change out of your clothes as soon as you get home and then leave them for several days before touching them again?
This probably isn't necessary for most people. This would be important for people working on the front line. They may want to change their clothes and put them straight into the wash when they get home of a day. But it looks like the virus can only survive for about a day on cloth. So we're probably okay if you're just staying at home, social isolating, and going to the shop occasionally. The chance of you having contaminated clothes is probably very, very small.
And Tom's last two quick questions. Does boiling the virus kill it?
Yes.
And does freezing the virus kill it?
We're unsure of that. It will probably reduce the amount of virus, but we actually, in the lab, we actually store viruses in the freezer. Our freezers are much colder than the ones you would have in your house, but that's how we actually preserve virus.
So it's probably not going to kill everything if you do freeze something.
Thank you for those, Lindsay. That was very impressive, your quick answers to those. Now, I want to talk about the whole topic of stigma. And Vivek, you've said that in India, even health workers can be stigmatized, even though they're the ones who are trying to help people with all this.
Yes, indeed. There have been some really unusual stories where health workers have been denied accommodation by landlords because people thought that they can potentially bring the infection to their homes and infect people living in that area. So this is really something which is real.
Christos, are you surprised that health workers would be stigmatized in this way?
To my knowledge, this is unusual, and I'm thinking, it is stigmatization is very common, but I cannot remember of another historical incident where this would be the place, stigmatizing the health workers or doctors or nurses. That's quite unusual, I think.
What sorts of things are we seeing generally when it comes to stigma in epidemics?
Well, unfortunately, it is very common to stigmatize Chinese people for the reason that xenophobia, which is a pervasive form of racism in the West, has emerged in connection with the fear of epidemics. So this connection of the xenophobia with epidemics is not new. It is part of this form of racism from its very beginning. And China was associated with the emergence of diseases, or China was seen as the mother of all diseases. Chinese people were stigmatized and treated really, really badly, with Chinatowns burned down or demolished in the States, for example, at the beginning of the century as a consequence.
And what about after people recover? I know that after the Ebola virus struck, many people are still stigmatized even after they've recovered. But Christos, I was wondering whether maybe that won't be the case this time because so many people will have had it.
There is a bit of an epistemic uncertainty regarding what happens after you've been infected. And the sooner this is clarified, the better, I think, because a lot of the misinformation or indeed disinformation on the media feed on uncertainty. Now, uncertainty, of course, in science is very important. Science can only progress through uncertainty, but we need to reach some conclusion soon regarding, for example, whether you acquire natural immunity, or there were some stories that people who had recovered manifest symptoms again, so they could possibly spread the disease again. So whether this is true or not has to be clarified very soon, and it has to become public knowledge. Not just clarified in the Lancet or in some medical journal. It has to be out there in the media so that people who recover are not stigmatized.
And I guess this brings us to the whole issue of people wanting to know who is safe to be beside or to touch and who is not safe to be beside or to touch. And of course, testing is one of the things that might tell people that. Vivek, we know that if someone gets the symptoms, they are contagious probably for a day or two before they've become ill themselves. Don't we really need to know whether there are some people who are asymptomatic and who are carrying the virus or did carry the virus for a while, even though they never had symptoms? Is that what we need to be able to test for?
Yes, indeed. I think that's really important if we want to break the chain of transmission, because the greatest risk is, as it appears from experience in Italy and in some other places, is from people who are considered to be non-infective because they don't have symptoms yet, and many of them are actually carrying the virus. In fact, one of my Italian colleagues who I was talking to a few days ago said very tellingly, fear the COVID negative ward, because that is where you are likely to get your infections most likely.
And Lindsay, when it comes to testing, there are two types of tests, aren't there? One to see if you've got the virus currently, and one that can tell if you've had it in the past. Do we know how accurate generally these tests are or will be?
There has been some debate over the accuracy of the current tests that are available. The test that's used for diagnosis at the minute is a molecular-based test, and we have to be very careful to pick part of the molecular genome of the virus that isn't like any other virus. And as we know, there are other coronaviruses such as SARS and MERS and even the common cold. So we need to make sure we don't have false positives from those. The tests used at the minute in most countries seem to be working very well. There were a few hiccups at the beginning, but that seems to have been sorted out incredibly quickly.
The other test you mentioned is very commonly referred to as the antibody test. Now, this won't help us in identifying cases as they become apparent and as people start to develop symptoms, because this relies on your body producing antibodies against the virus. So that can take a few days, if not a couple of weeks, until you can actually use this test to get a reliable result. But what this can be used for is figuring out who has actually had the virus. Those antibodies should hang around in our bodies for quite a while, for a few months at least. And using that, we can then tell who is probably going to be immune to getting this virus again, and therefore those people could be used to help get essential services back up and running. They might be able to return to work. They could be helping out and volunteering to provide reinforcement to the health services. And it will give us an overall idea of how many people in total were actually infected and how many of those people were completely asymptomatic.
Well, we have a question on that actually from Gary Abirami, who'd read about plans in Germany to test people and then issue immunity certificates so that they could start working again and being useful. And she says she can't imagine this happening in India with a population of 1.3 billion and wonders how a lockdown could ever be lifted in India for life to go back to normal. Vivek, what would you say to that? Could testing be a part of this in India?
So testing is essential. We are not going to be able to really be able to answer this question that is so important right now. That's the uppermost question in everyone's mind as to what do we do after the lockdown ends. And the only answer that every public health expert comes up with is that we have to keep testing more people. There have been some signs that in recent days, government has ramped up the testing capability, and with the availability of the new antibody test, possibly it might become easy to test large number of people in relatively short spans of time and get results relatively quickly. So that should help.
And modelling in New Zealand suggests that even if you lock down for 400 days, so that's more than a year, 400 days, that as soon as you opened up again, the virus would start to spread. So it's quite hard to see how you can ever lift these things. Lindsay, what would you say to that?
Yes, the timing of removing restrictions is really important. If we look at the 1918 influenza pandemic that occurred in 2 cities in America, the restrictions were lifted 2 weeks earlier in one city, and they saw a massive second peak of infections. In another city that lengthened the time of social distancing and isolation, they did not see that second peak reach the same levels. So we really have to be careful about when we decide to loosen some of the restrictions in place. And I think at the minute, everyone's keeping a really close eye on what's happening in China, and specifically in Wuhan, because that'll give us a fantastic idea of what is likely to occur in other countries around the world.
And we talked about these two different kinds of tests. Vivek, which of these two tests would you say is more pressing for somewhere like India? The one to diagnose whether people have it in the first place, or to get that antibody test ready for everybody to be able to have that?
I think for screening of large number of people relatively quickly and get results that are going to be informative so far as public health policy is concerned, it is the latter, the antibody test. However, for an individual who has potential infection and wants to find out whether they have coronavirus or not, it is the first test that is going to be more useful for that particular individual.
Now, the other big hopes, of course, for putting an end to all this are, of course, a vaccine, which we know would take at least a year to develop, if we're lucky, or successful treatments. Lindsay, you've just got a grant to screen existing drugs and then test the most promising ones in the lab. When you're screening them, what are you looking for? How do you tell whether it's something that might work?
So initially, we will be screening over 1,000 drugs, and we will quite simply be looking to see if these drugs help the survival of the infected cells. So we will infect cells with the SARS-CoV-2 virus, then we will treat with the drug and figure out if any of those cells are doing better, looking better, and surviving better compared to the ones that aren't treated. From there, we will narrow it down and do further research and figure out the effect of these drugs on the virus growth and on the innate immune response of humans.
And will you be concentrating on using antivirals first?
No, we will certainly be including antivirals, but we won't be concentrating on them. And that's because drug repurposing has been successful in many different fields before. So we want to be able to include drugs such as anti-inflammatories, maybe some drugs used to treat heart disease, for example, and see if they have any effect.
And we have time for a couple more listener questions. Blaine Taylor from Canada, who says he's a long-time listener and a first-time questioner, wants to know about whether COVID-19 will spread faster in high humidity areas and how altitude might affect the virus. Vivek, do we know the answer to those questions?
So the conventional wisdom is that COVID-19 spread will be negatively affected by high humidity, which means that the spread will come down by high humidity. In terms of high altitude, I honestly don't know the answer. Maybe Lindsay might be able to help.
Lindsay, do you know?
I wish I did, but no, I can't answer that.
Fair enough. And from Dennis Jowers, this question, a lot of people have been asking me this actually, about people who report that they've lost their sense of smell or taste before they've developed symptoms. And actually one listener told me she couldn't even smell lavender oil or garlic. And Dennis wonders whether there could be some kind of smell test that people could do on themselves, and then just those people could self-isolate. What do you make of that idea, Vivek?
A number of people have that loss of a sense of smell and a loss of sense of taste is an early symptom of this COVID infection. Now, to make a suggestion that's sensitive and specific enough for people to take decisions about whether or not to isolate will be a step too far. I think we should rely on the tried and tested diagnostic test.
Now, before we go, let me ask all of you whether you're currently veering towards optimism or pessimism with this outbreak. Lindsay, what would you say?
I won't put my hat in either ring. I'm trying to be realistic, I think, here. I think we are going to see more confirmed cases. We are going to see many more deaths. However, the amount of research that's being done is increasing all the time. I think we will have a treatment option incredibly quickly. And I think governments are responding, and the healthcare workers and frontline workers are doing an incredible job.
Vivek, what would you say?
I would echo what Lindsay just said. We need to be optimistic in medicine always, and scientific progress is fast. Ultimately, the science will deliver us. We will have an antiviral drug, an immunomodulator that we have currently could potentially work in this situation. There are a number of drugs which are already undergoing clinical trials. So the scientific community is really very active, and hopefully we will find an answer very soon. But in the short term, if countries do not gear up and strengthen their capacity both for doing more testing and to be able to provide sufficient personal protective equipment for the healthcare workers who are going to be in the front line of dealing with the deluge of cases that may come, then situation could become really grim, I'm afraid.
And Christos, I guess it's important that people keep in mind that this is a difficult time, but it will end one day. What can history tell us about how the world can emerge from a global pandemic?
Well, that's a very difficult question. Different societies emerge in different shape. I would like to stress that this is not just a medical question, this is a social question as well, and one would hope that societies would come out of this and remain democratic, or even be more democratic than they currently are. There are some not so good signs as regards this in some parts of the world, but that's up to societies to act upon and decide.
Absolutely. Well, thank you to everyone who sent in their questions. We'll be back with more from the evidence in 2 weeks' time, so do keep sending in your questions. You can email us at the.evidence@bbc.co.uk, or you can find me on Instagram and Twitter at Claudia Hammond. And thank you so much to my guests, Christos Linteris, Lindsay Broadbent and Vivek Jha, and also from earlier, Sarah Tossato. The producer was Geraldine Fitzgerald, and The Evidence is a collaboration with Wellcome Collection. Bye for now. Stay safe.
This is the BBC World Service, where we bring you a twice-daily coronavirus update.
Pandemic.
Social distancing.
State of emergency.
To try and halt the spread of the virus.
As the coronavirus story develops, we're bringing you the very latest.
The government's ratcheted up its response.
A twice-daily roundup of news, information and health advice.
Isolation is absolutely necessary.
The Coronavirus Global Update. Find it at bbcworldservice.com. And in 60 minutes, the History Hour with Max Pearson.
This week, the lawyer who blazed a trail for British women in the 1950s. Also, the moment Sweden's maritime history emerged in all its glory. And from the 1990s, how the world's most massive organism was identified.
That's in an hour. The newsroom is next on the BBC World Service, the world's radio station.
At 18 hours GMT, welcome to the newsroom from the BBC World Service. I'm Jeanette Jalil. Millions of Indians turn off their lights and light candles and lamps in response to the Prime Minister's call for a show of unity against the coronavirus.
Lots of mobile torches being flashed, lots of oil lamps. In fact, the exuberance was so much that there were firecrackers being burst.
But critics say it's a gimmick. Spain, one of the country's hardest hit, records another daily fall in COVID-19 deaths.
The figures lead us to clearly affirm that the confinement measures which the Spanish people are complying with in an exemplary way are working.
But Spain also reveals it's fined hundreds of thousands of people to enforce its lockdown. And we hear why Nicaragua's football teams are continuing to play despite fears about the virus. That's all coming up on the newsroom.
Hello, I'm David Harper with the BBC News. Many millions of people across India have switched off their electric lights and lit lamps and candles to show solidarity in the fight against the coronavirus. A gesture of unity to last for 9 minutes was called for by the Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi. From Delhi, Divya Arya.
This show of national solidarity was designed to symbolize the victory of light over the darkness of the coronavirus pandemic. A country of more than 1 billion people switched off their lights together and flashed torches and oil lamps on their balconies. The opposition have dismissed the event as a mere photo opportunity, accusing the government of failing to address more pressing issues such as facilities for health workers and financial support for the poor.
Spain has fined more than 300,000 people for flouting coronavirus restrictions. The Interior Minister said a similar number had been arrested, but as Guy Hedgecoe reports from Madrid, there are signs of hope about the pandemic itself.
Although the daily death toll remains high in Spain, these latest figures reinforce the hope that the virus is stabilising. The number of deaths over the last 24 hours, 674, is the lowest figure for a week and a half. The number of new infections, just over 6,000, also reflects a slowing of the spread of coronavirus. Spain has been in lockdown for 3 weeks. The Prime Minister, Pedro Sánchez, plans to extend that measure until the end of the month at the earliest.
The Chief Medical Officer for Scotland has been removed from the coronavirus public information campaign for flouting the rules she promotes. She's to remain a clinical advisor, but police issued a warning to Catherine Calderwood after it emerged she had driven to the family's country home 2 weekends running, despite government advice not to travel. She apologised on television.
People have told me that I'm irresponsible, that I've behaved as if my advice does not apply to me. I want people to know that I have seen all of that, and I've heard the comment. What I did was wrong. I'm very sorry.
Tuscany is the latest province in northern Italy to make it obligatory for residents to wear a face mask when leaving their homes. The governor said he'd decided to distribute 10 million masks to Tuscans for free and would make another 10 million available later. Here in Britain, Queen Elizabeth will make a rare address in the next hour to urge people to show self-discipline and resolve during the pandemic. In an address to the nation, she is expected to acknowledge the grief, pain and financial difficulties Britons are facing and thank National Health Service staff. The Queen will praise the way people have risen to the occasion and say that the Britons of this generation are as strong as any, showing self-discipline and quite good-humoured resolve. This is the latest world news from the BBC. The acting head of Ukraine's Environmental Inspectorate has said radiation inside a forest fire near the stricken Chernobyl nuclear power plant is 16 times above the norm. Yegor Feartsov posted a video of a counter showing high levels. He blamed arsonists for the blaze and demanded stiffer penalties. A key figure in the overthrow of the Libyan dictator, Colonel Muammar Gaddafi, has died of the coronavirus. Mahmoud Jibril, who was 67, had been suffering from heart problems. Yusuf Taha reports.
Mr. Jibril had been an influential figure in the Gaddafi regime, but he claimed he had little choice. During the rebellion against Mr. Gaddafi, he headed an interim government. He said he would resign from office once Libya had been liberated, and he did so 3 days after the dictator was captured and killed in October 2011. Mr. Jibril was seen as a potential future leader in post-Gaddafi Libya, but a new law banned former Gaddafi officials from running for public office. Mr. Jibril's National Forces Alliance led in Libya's 2012 election, the first democratic poll to be held in decades.
Police in South Africa have arrested a bride and groom, a priest and 40 guests who defied the rules of the country's strict coronavirus lockdown to hold a wedding in KwaZulu-Natal province. Video footage showed the groom helping his bride-to-be into the back of a police car, wearing her wedding dress complete with train. A man who became lost while crossing from France into Spain to buy cheap cigarettes has been rescued by emergency services in the Pyrenees Mountains and fined for breaking anti-coronavirus rules. The man set off by car on Saturday from Perpignan in southern France, heading for La Jonquera in Spain. When he was stopped at a checkpoint, he then tried to cross the border on foot through the mountains. He fell into a stream, became lost, and had to be rescued by helicopter. After he was brought back safely, he was fined $146. BBC News.
Hello and welcome to the newsroom from the BBC World Service with me, Jeanette Jalil. Different countries have chosen different ways to fight the coronavirus. On Sunday night, millions of Indians switched off their lights and lit candles, lamps and flashed torches in response to an appeal by the Prime Minister Narendra Modi to ward off the darkness of the virus. But the symbolic gesture has been criticised as a gimmick, and the Prime Minister's critics say he should be focusing on the plight of the poor instead. Our correspondent Divya Arya told me how people in Delhi had responded to Mr. Modi's call.
There was absolute compliance till as far as I could see from my balcony. Completely dark out there, and lots of mobile torches being flashed, lots of oil lamps. In fact, the exuberance was so much that there were firecrackers being burst. There were also slogans being shouted of Hail Mother India. And that's not just happened in my neighborhood, but across the country. I've been looking at reports coming from different parts of the country, similar things, fireworks and conch playing, which is a very symbolic Hindu tradition of announcing victory, and slogans of Hail Mother India.
But this has been dismissed by Mr. Modi's critics as a PR stunt.
Indeed, but it seems that it has been quite popular with people. Now, the critics say that this is a gimmick to take away attention from what the government needs to answer for, and that is facilities for health workers. There have been many complaints that personal protective equipment is not available and doctors are being forced to do their duty without adequate protection. Then there's also been a lot of criticism of people not given enough notice when the lockdown, which India is now in the middle of a 3-week lockdown, we're into the 11th day, and people didn't have enough notice and therefore have suddenly been rendered jobless without enough savings and are struggling for food to eat.
And what is the government doing in response to this criticism? Because there have been some really heartbreaking stories about how this lockdown has hurt India's poor.
Indeed, there are thousands, tens of thousands of people who work in big cities but come from villages and smaller cities. Now, these are daily wage labor, so they do not have, deep pockets. And when the lockdown was announced with just a 4-hour notice, a 3-week lockdown with just a 4-hour notice, there was panic. They wanted to return to their houses where they felt that they had some support from their families, some savings, some way to even feed themselves. But that did not happen, and they now feel very stranded. And despite the government promising them a financial package, food and shelter, It remains to be seen how those benefits will reach them because so many restrictions are in place.
Divya Arya. Meanwhile, after 3 weeks of near total coronavirus lockdown and the second highest number of deaths after Italy, Spain is hoping that it's beginning to see the light at the end of the tunnel. The number of people to die from the disease in the past 24 hours has fallen again, although it's still well over 600, and there's also been a downward trend in the rate of infection in the past week. The Spanish Health Minister, Salvador Illa, said the statistics show that the country's tough lockdown is working.
The figures lead us to clearly affirm that the confinement measures which the Spanish people are complying with in an exemplary way are working.
I asked our correspondent in Madrid, Guy Hedgecoe, if Spain was finally turning a corner in its battle with the virus.
That certainly seems to be the feeling. Over the last few days, the government has been saying that that was the case, that the figures are stabilising. Today's number of deaths from the last 24 hours is 674. Obviously, that's still a very dramatic number, but it's much lower than yesterday's, which was 809. Just a few days ago, we had well over 900. So that number seems to be coming down, as does the number of new daily infections. The latest number was just over 6,000, which again sounds like a lot, but that's quite a bit lower than we have been seeing earlier on in this crisis. So the authorities believe that this reflects a stabilisation of the figures, and that although they are still rather dramatic, and that total number of deaths at over 12,000 obviously is tragic, but the figures do seem to be coming down, or coming under control at least.
And this seems to be in large part down to the lockdown, which the Spanish government wants to extend for another 2 weeks. And we've been hearing how strictly Spain has been enforcing this lockdown, with a huge number of people being fined.
Yes, that's right. The Interior Minister, Fernando Grande Marlaska, has given us the latest figures in terms of fines and arrests related to violations of the lockdown. And over 300,000 people have been fined because of that, and nearly 3,000 people have been arrested for related infractions. So, that sounds like a huge number, and that perhaps suggests that lots of people are out flouting these restrictions. But I think what it also points to, or perhaps what it points to more, is how strictly the police are enforcing these restrictions. They carried out 3 million checks on cars, for example, and there is a very heavy police presence, and they really are clamping down when it comes to enforcing these restrictions. But also, I think people feel a social responsibility to comply with this state of emergency as well. So that helps explain why it seems to be working broadly, even though there have been this high number of fines.
Guy Hedgecoe. New rules have come into force in Italy, meaning people living in certain regions have to wear a face mask whenever they leave their home. Italy's outbreak is the worst in the world, with almost 16,000 people dying there so far. But there are signs the epidemic may have reached its peak there as well, with the number of daily deaths beginning to fall. Our correspondent Jean Mackenzie sent this report from Rome.
Face masks are now compulsory in the 3 regions which have been hit hardest by the virus, including Lombardy in the north. But the order might soon be extended to other parts of the country. The strict measure comes at a critical time for Italy. The rate of infection has slowed here over the past week, and the number of daily deaths is down for the 2nd day in a row. But the health minister, Roberto Speranza, has said that Italians have to learn now to live with the virus until a vaccine is found. Authorities know that any recovery will be fragile. They're nervous about a further outbreak and say this is not the time to relax.
Jean Mackenzie. You're listening to the BBC World Service. Now David has the headlines.
Hundreds of millions of Indians have turned their electric lights off and lit candles in a show of unity against the coronavirus. But critics say it's a gimmick by the Prime Minister. Spain, one of the worst affected countries, has recorded a further fall in the number of deaths from COVID-19. And Scotland's chief medical officer has been removed from a public information campaign about the coronavirus because she flouted the official travel rules.
Yes, police have issued a warning to Dr. Catherine Calderwood after it emerged in the media that she'd made family trips to her second home on 2 consecutive weekends. Scotland's First Minister, Nicola Sturgeon, has said she's standing by Dr. Calderwood. Alexandra Mackenzie reports.
Day after day, Scotland's chief medical officer has told millions of people to stay at home to help save lives. But after pictures were published, Dr. Catherine Calderwood was forced to admit she had travelled from where she lives in Edinburgh to her second home in Fife, both this weekend and last weekend. During an excruciating news conference, Dr. Catherine Calderwood said she was truly sorry for her behaviour.
I do not offer any justification for what I did. It was wrong. I have seen the anger that people have. I have heard from some of my own NHS colleagues, and I have let not only them in the NHS down, but also the general public down.
Standing by her chief medical officer, Scotland's First Minister Nicola Sturgeon said Dr. Calderwood had a job to do, but that she wouldn't be doing any further public briefings from now on.
I know how vital the advice and the expertise she gives to me is in the judgments I have to make about how we steer the country through. I don't justify or condone or ask people not to be angry, but I do ask people to understand the wider importance of that as we tackle this virus.
Many have expressed anger at Catherine Calderwood's actions. Police Scotland said they had spoken to her and emphasised that the stay-at-home rules apply to everyone.
Alexandra Mackenzie. New York accounts for nearly half of all coronavirus deaths in the US. But in his latest news briefing, the governor of New York, Andrew Cuomo, says that the daily number of deaths and people requiring hospital treatment has been dropping for the first time in the past few days. He said 594 people had died from the virus in the past 24 hours. And despite the huge pressure on hospitals, he said he was determined that resources within the state would be shared, although he also expressed concern that the state was running out of supplies.
The concept here that people have to get is nobody can handle this alone. This virus will overwhelm the resources of any single community. Our wisdom here in New York and our ethos is we'll help one another. This surge flex, every day we sit there allocating among hospitals, shifting gowns, shifting masks, shifting patients. We will come to a point where that wave will run right through the state. I guarantee the people of this state that as long as I'm governor of this state, we won't lose a life if we can prevent it. And we're not going to lose a life because we didn't share resources among ourselves.
New York Governor Andrew Cuomo. 10 days ago, South Africa introduced a lockdown to slow the spread of the coronavirus, which has hit the country as no other on the continent. But the measures not only had an effect on the spread of the virus, but also on serious crime. I asked our Africa regional editor, Will Ross, how significant a drop in crime had occurred.
It's interesting that the police have given out these statistics which certainly show a reduction in the amount of crime that's gone on over the last few days. What the authorities have been saying, they've sort of divided it up into various categories, but they're saying comparing the first week of the lockdown when these severe restrictions have been in place with the same week a year ago, murder cases have gone down from 326 to 94, and reported rape cases have gone down from 699 to 101. So a dramatic fall there, and also assault involving grievous bodily harm from well over 2,500 down to under 500 cases. So fairly dramatic drops in those statistics that they've given out.
I suppose it's not entirely surprising given that there is a lockdown, but what is the reason the authorities are giving for this big drop in crime?
Well, the authorities and the police chief himself, Becky Nele, he actually said that it's down to the fact that there's a ban on the sale of alcohol. He specifically said it was due to that, and it is true that it's hard to get hold of alcohol now in South Africa if you hadn't sort of got a supply in before the lockdown began. But of course, people will look at what's going on and the severe restrictions on movement and say that it's basically because people can't move around to carry out these crimes. It's also interesting that gender-based violence is still a huge problem, and the police say that over 2,000 cases of gender-based violence were recorded over a one-week period.
Will Ross, a prominent Chinese human rights lawyer, has been released from prison after spending nearly 5 years in jail for subversion. But as Michael Bristow reports, he's not really free.
Wang Quanzhang was detained along with more than 200 others in a notorious crackdown on activists by China in 2015. He appears to have been targeted because he took on politically sensitive cases. For 3 years, his family heard nothing from the authorities about his detention. They didn't know whether he was dead or alive. He was finally sentenced at the beginning of last year for subversion. He's been released after serving his time. But in China, being let out of prison doesn't necessarily mean freedom, particularly for activists like Wang Quanzhang. He's not been allowed to return to Beijing to be with his wife and son. Instead, he's been forced to go live in the city of Jinan, hundreds of kilometers away. In this telephone conversation to his wife from prison on Saturday, the lawyer begins to tell her he might not be coming home. This is her angry response. No way, she says. But of course, it's not her decision. Other politically sensitive cases have been dealt with in the same way. One US expert on China's legal system has called this practice the non-release release. In China, if the Communist Party wants to keep you under detention, it doesn't matter that law says you should be a free man.
Michael Bristow. Now David has some other stories from our news desk.
People in mandatory quarantine in Kenya have complained of inhumane treatment after the government decided to extend their period of isolation from 14 days to a month. It applies to any facilities where there has been a confirmed case of the coronavirus. More than 2,000 people, including foreign nationals and Kenyans, were ordered to stay in hotels and government facilities upon arrival in the country. On Saturday, the health minister said some in quarantine had not been following guidelines and had even held parties. Ireland's Prime Minister Leo Varadkar has re-registered as a medical practitioner and will work one shift a week to help out during the coronavirus crisis. Varadkar worked as a doctor for 7 years before leaving the profession to become a politician and was removed from the medical register in 2013. From Monday, it will be compulsory to wear basic face masks in supermarkets in Austria, the latest step the country has taken to try to halt the spread of COVID-19. Austria's Chancellor, Sebastian Kurz, has said masks may soon be required in public places in general as part of the exit strategy from lockdown. And one of Britain's best-known aristocrats, Lord Bath, has died at the age of 87 after testing positive for coronavirus. Lord Bath was the owner of Longleat Safari Park, where, from the safety of their cars, the public are able to see lions, giraffes and other animals roaming free. Duncan Kennedy looks back at his life.
The 7th Marquess of Bath was almost a byword for flamboyance and charisma. Growing up in Longleat House in Wiltshire, Alexander Thynne passed through Eton, the Lifeguards and Oxford. In the 1950s, during a stay in Paris, he developed his colourful style of dress, becoming a prolific amateur painter. Lord Bath's family have issued a statement thanking the medical staff who cared for him since he contracted COVID-19.
Duncan Kennedy reporting.
Life in one of Ecuador's most populous cities, Guayaquil, is being likened to being in a horror film as the bodies of those who have died of coronavirus are being dumped in the streets, with local morgues overwhelmed. According to official figures, more than 300 people have died of the coronavirus in Ecuador, more than anywhere else in Latin America apart from Brazil. But some within the country say this number is most certainly higher. Matthew Charles has more, and we'd like to warn you that some listeners may be upset by some of the details in his report.
A man films the body of his brother. He's been left in the gutter, along with the rubbish, and is covered in a simple white sheet. He's one of the many that have succumbed to coronavirus in Guayaquil, but there's nobody to collect the body and nowhere to take it. The health system here has collapsed. Emergency calls are being ignored, and hospitals are turning people away. Mortuaries are overflowing, and funeral homes are unable to cope with the demand.
El coronavirus en Ecuador se salió de control.
This TV news report shows the streets in Ecuador's largest city lined with bodies. Families have had no option but to leave their loved ones to the elements. Outside an emergency department in the city, this man begs for help. He's brought a seriously ill pensioner for urgent medical attention, but is denied entry to the hospital. The patient, who's struggling to breathe, is left in the back of a truck with nobody to help. Inside the hospital, this video, filmed secretly by medical staff, shows dozens of corpses wrapped in black body bags lining the floors. Above the hospital, vultures circle. They're attracted by the smell of the cadavers. It's a grim and disturbing scene. Authorities have announced they'll create a task force for collecting and burying the dead. The country's vice president has moved his office to Guayaquil to deal with the crisis. But many residents are questioning how the health system in their city of 2 million could collapse if the number of deaths from coronavirus is as low as the government believes. Campaigners say the official statistics don't add up, and the bodies littered on the streets are proof of that.
Han permanecido esos cadáveres en esos domicilios.
Billy Navarrete is a human rights defender in the city.
No hay duda de que las cifras que maneja el gobierno.
There's no doubt their numbers are not exact, nor do they reflect the real number of deaths, he says. The government has committed a grave mistake, says Professor Héctor Hugo from Guayaquil University.
Primero, se tiene que trabajar en base a las proyecciones.
They need to work on projections, he says. In a country where we have little ability to do large-scale testing, the numbers that rely on these tests will only tell part of the picture. Our modelling shows the number of cases to be much higher. The response should be based on these projections. Officials fear that panic could now spread in Guayaquil, the epicenter of Ecuador's outbreak, as many residents, fearing for their lives, may try to flee the city.
Matthew Charles reporting. Sunday is usually a busy day for football around the world, but currently there are only 4 countries who are continuing to play in the midst of the COVID-19 outbreak: Belarus, Burundi, Tajikistan and Nicaragua. The decision to carry on playing in the Central American country has led to a surge of interest in their 10-team top division, but it hasn't been universally welcomed by the clubs involved. Nigel Adley told me more about the Nicaraguan leadership's apparent attitude towards the coronavirus and football.
Well, there are currently 5 reported cases and 1 death in the country, and the President, Daniel Ortega, I think is determined to maintain an air of normality at a time when many other countries are enforcing quarantine and lockdowns. The Vice President, Rosario Murillo, who is also the President's wife, has insisted that tourist activities continue, and the capital, Managua, hosted a mini marathon for hundreds of fun runners on Friday to help start a week of celebrations heading towards Easter. The health minister was also sacked last week, and I think the general approach is business as usual, so football continues, and although the matches are behind closed doors, there are 3 games on Sunday.
So what can teams who are uneasy about playing actually do?
Very little, it seems. The vast majority of the teams in the top division have links with arms of the state. There's one owned by the police force, another club in Managua is bankrolled by the city's mayor, and the players who feature for these teams all say the same thing. They'll play until the government decides to call a halt. Dilianguen are the one side which voted against playing. They're independent of the state, but they did play on Wednesday. They all wore face masks and they beat the police team, and they're also playing on Sunday. And their general manager, Sergio Salazar, says the players are really scared, but they don't feel as though they have any choice. They have to play.
So is this paying off for the footballing authorities in Nicaragua? Are more people watching the Nicaraguan league now?
It seems they are. Rather like the situation in Europe, in Belarus, there are sports channels around the world with nothing to show. So they're expressing an interest in showing anything. And the Nicaraguan league falls into that category at the moment. And sports betting companies will also see it as an opportunity because gamblers at the moment have nothing to look at either. So it could prove to be an unexpected windfall for the sport in Nicaragua. And presumably in the current climate, the president will be fairly happy about that as well.
Nigel Adley there. We've got some breaking news that's come out of France. In the past few minutes, it has announced another 357 coronavirus deaths in hospital, as compared to 441 yesterday and 588 the day before. But to that total, we must add that there have been another 71 deaths in old people's nursing or care homes. That seems to be a fall for the third consecutive day in the number of coronavirus deaths in France. Thanks for listening to the newsroom.
This is the BBC World Service, where we're navigating the world through sound.
You can sense the contrast of the city as much by its sounds as by its sights. This is the archetypal Australian sound. They're just getting ready for the barbecue. Oh, that smells good.
Yeah, I made it myself, I did.
Did you?
Yeah.
It's a very good city for a blind person. It's square. In the city itself, there's beautiful sounds like St Paul's Cathedral when the bells are ringing there, or our post office clock which bangs away like Big Ben.
Exploring the Australian city, the cricket grounds, the seaside and the harbour.
And most of my weekends were spent right over there on the beach, just doing nothing. Sitting around, swimming, talking to girls. That's pretty much about it.
Sounds of the City, Tuesday at 12:30 and 21 GMT.
Apollo 13 is approaching the fourth day of its ill-fated flight. They have battled against failing systems and a dying spacecraft ever since. Their life support and power are running out. They're now on a path that will take them home, but travelling too slowly to get them back to the right place on Earth in good time. Hear how the drama unfolded in Apollo 13 from the BBC World Service with me, Kevin Fong, in a couple of minutes.
BBC News with David Harper. Hundreds of millions of people across India have switched off their electric lights and lit lamps and candles to show solidarity in the fight against the coronavirus. The gesture, which lasted for 9 minutes, was called for by the Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi, but was criticised as a gimmick. Spain has fined more than 300,000 people for flouting coronavirus restrictions that began 3 weeks ago. The Interior Minister said a similar number had been arrested. For the third day running, the number of new coronavirus deaths in Spain fell, this time to 674. Scotland's chief medical officer has been removed from the coronavirus public information campaign for flouting the rules she promotes. Police issued a warning to Catherine Calderwood after it emerged that she'd driven 70 kilometres from Edinburgh to the family's country home in Fife 2 weekends running, despite government advice not to travel. Here in Britain, Queen Elizabeth will make a rare address in half an hour's time to urge people to show self-discipline and resolve during the pandemic. In a national address, she is expected to acknowledge the grief, pain and financial difficulties Britons are facing and thank National Health Service staff and key workers. A key figure in the overthrow of the Libyan dictator Colonel Gaddafi has died of the coronavirus. Mahmoud Jibril was 67. He'd been an influential figure in the Gaddafi regime, but claimed he'd had little choice. Mr. Jibril had been in quarantine in a Cairo hospital since being diagnosed with coronavirus on March the 27th. Police in South Africa have arrested a bride and groom, a priest and 40 guests who defied the rules of the country's strict coronavirus lockdown to hold a wedding in KwaZulu-Natal province. The whole group were taken to a police station near Richards Bay. They're due to be charged in court on Monday. BBC News.
You're listening to the BBC World Service with me, Kevin Fong, as we continue the incredible story of the flight of Apollo 13, told by the people who flew it and saved it. Apollo 13 is approaching the fourth day of its ill-fated flight. 9 hours ago, an explosion crippled their command module. They have battled against failing systems and a dying spacecraft ever since. It's now all about creating what opportunities they can from moment to moment, and this is how they hope to buy their survival. Across the United States, millions tune in to the television coverage. Veteran CBS News anchor Walter Cronkite leads the nation through the crisis.
The flight of the Apollo
is in serious jeopardy this morning and is not going to make a moon landing. And this is indeed the gravest emergency probably yet in the American space program.
Their life support and power are running out. They're now on a path that will take them home, but travelling too slowly to get them back to the right place on Earth in good time.
Our job was basically to try to figure out what on board the spacecraft was still usable. We had a command module that was our re-entry vessel. It had the heat shield, but it had only about 2.5 hours of electrical power lifetime. We had the service module, which is where the explosion had occurred. It was virtually useless. We had the lunar modules attached from the other end of the stack through a small tunnel, and that was our lifeboat.
Flight Director Jerry Griffin is coming on shift to take charge of mission control for this next critical stage of the mission. And he remembers exactly where he was when he learned that Apollo 13 was in trouble.
I went out to play a softball game.